The rain fell soft and cold over Arlington National Cemetery that November morning. It was the kind of rain that seeped into old bones and awakened memories that most men spent decades trying to forget. The kind of rain that made old soldiers stand a little straighter, as if the cold could somehow wash away the weight of the years they had carried through a lifetime of service and sacrifice. Raymond Colton stood alone before a white marble headstone in Section 60, the part of the cemetery reserved for those who had fallen in the most recent conflicts. 70 years old, spine still straight from decades of military discipline that had become as natural as breathing. Hands weathered like ancient oak, scarred across the knuckles from fights he barely remembered and work he would never forget. He wore no umbrella. Let the rain come. He had earned the right to stand in any storm. The cemetery stretched before him in perfect rows, thousands of markers standing at attention even in death. Each stone represented a life given in service to something greater than any individual could comprehend. Each name carved in marble was a promise kept, a sacrifice made, a family forever changed by the cruel mathematics of war. The morning mist clung to the ground like a shroud, softening the edges of the world, making the boundary between the living and the dead seem thin and permeable. Raymond had been coming here every November 15th for the past 30 years. Same day, same hour, same ritual that had become as essential to his existence as breathing. He would take the early morning flight from San Diego, watching the American landscape scroll past his window in the pre-dawn darkness. Cities and farms and mountains, all the places that free men could live because other men had chosen to die for them. He would rent a car at Reagan National and drive through the quiet streets of the capital while most of the city still slept. He would arrive at the cemetery before dawn, when the grounds were empty and the dead could speak without interruption from tourists and politicians who came to pay respects they had not earned. And then he would stand here, in the rain or the sun or the bitter cold, and he would talk to a dead man. A man who had given everything so that Raymond could have everything. A man whose sacrifice had defined Raymond's entire existence for 3 decades. His fingers trembled as he reached toward the headstone, not from the cold, though the November air bit through his coat with teeth of ice. Not from age, though 70 years had taken their toll on muscles and joints that had once been forged from steel. The trembling came from something deeper, something that had lived inside his chest for 30 years like a second heartbeat, a constant companion, a weight he had never been able to set down, no matter how far he walked or how many years passed. Colonel Harold James Mercer, 1950 to 1994. Medal of Honor. The name was carved into the white marble with military precision. Below it, the simple inscription that Harold's widow had chosen after weeks of agonizing over what words could possibly capture the essence of the man she had loved. He gave everything so others could live. 9 words. 9 words to summarize a life of service, a career of courage, a death of extraordinary sacrifice. 9 words that Raymond read every year on this day, and every year they seemed both too few and exactly right. Raymond pressed his palm flat against the cold stone. The marble seemed to pulse beneath his touch. Or maybe that was just his own heart, beating too fast for a man his age. His doctor had warned him about these trips, the stress of travel, the emotional toll of revisiting old wounds, the strain on a cardiovascular system that had already survived 2 minor heart attacks and was held together more by stubbornness than by modern medicine. Raymond had smiled at the doctor, a young man barely old enough to shave who could not possibly understand, and told him he would rather die standing before this grave than live another decade without making this pilgrimage. Some debts were beyond the understanding of men who had never served in the shadows. Some obligations transcended the simple calculations of health and longevity. "Hello, Hal," he whispered, the words barely audible above the soft patter of rain on stone and grass. "I came back, just like I promised, just like I always will, until my own name is carved on one of these stones and someone else has to carry the weight I am carrying now." The rain intensified, shifting from gentle mist to actual drops that streamed down the white marble like tears. The stone itself was crying for all the men and women it represented. Raymond did not move. He had operated in monsoons in Central America, rain so thick you could barely see your hand in front of your face. He had crawled through jungles in 3 continents, while tracers lit up the night sky like deadly fireworks. He had lain in mud for hours, waiting for extraction helicopters that might never come, the rain filling his foxhole inch by inch, while he prayed to a God he was not sure he believed in. A little November rain in Arlington was nothing compared to what he had survived. What they had survived together. What Harold had not survived so that Raymond could. 30 years ago, Raymond Colton had been a 40-year-old master sergeant running classified missions with the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, the organization that did not officially exist, the unit whose operations would never appear in any history book, whose sacrifices would never be acknowledged in any public ceremony, whose warriors would never march in any parade or receive any public recognition for the impossible things they accomplished in the darkness. They went where no American forces were supposed to be. Central America during the final convulsions of the Cold War, hunting drug cartels that had become indistinguishable from terrorist organizations. The Middle East as ancient hatreds flared into modern conflicts that would reshape the world for generations to come. Africa, where forgotten wars consumed entire nations while the world looked away, where warlords built empires on the bodies of children and the international community wrung its hands and did nothing. Small teams of the most elite soldiers America had ever produced, operating in complete secrecy, doing the impossible night after night, coming home in body bags that were explained away as training accidents or filed under classifications so deep that even the families would never know the truth of how their loved ones had died or what they had died for. The casualty rate for these operations was never officially recorded because officially the operations never happened. The men who died were honored in private ceremonies held in anonymous buildings on military bases, their sacrifices known only to their brothers in arms and the commanders who had sent them into the darkness. Many never came home at all, their bodies lost in jungles and deserts and mountains that most Americans could not find on a map, that most Americans did not even know existed. Their families received folded flags and empty condolences and the cold comfort of knowing their loved ones had died for their country, even if they could never know how or where or why. Raymond had been wounded 3 times during his 2 decades of special operations service. Once in the shoulder during an operation in Honduras, a through and through from a rifle round that had missed his heart by less than 2 inches. The medic who saved his life that night later died in another operation, another country, another impossible mission. Once in the thigh in Somalia, shrapnel from an improvised explosive device that had killed the man standing next to him, a sergeant named Rodriguez, who had 3 children and a wife who would never understand why her husband had to die in a country she had never heard of. Once in the gut in Colombia, a wound that should have been fatal but somehow was not, as if the universe had decided Raymond Colton still had something left to do before he was allowed to rest. He still carried fragments of metal in his abdomen, set off metal detectors at every airport he passed through, a minor inconvenience that served as a constant reminder of all the metal that had passed through other men who had not been as lucky. The TSA agents would look at his scars and his military ID and wave him through with the respectful nods reserved for those who had obviously paid a price for their service. A permanent souvenir from wars that most Americans would never know were fought, carried in his flesh like a secret he could never fully share. Colonel Harold Mercer had been his commanding officer during the most intense period of those shadow operations. 44 years old when he died, still young enough to have decades ahead of him, old enough to have accumulated the wisdom that only comes from years of leading men into impossible situations and bringing most of them home again. Career military with a spine of steel and a heart that could encompass the fears and hopes of every man under his command. West Point graduate, class of 1972, back when idealism still meant something and young officers still believed they could make a difference in a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart. Harold Mercer was the kind of leader who was born rather than made, the kind of officer who led from the front, not from behind a desk in some air-conditioned headquarters building hundreds of miles from the fighting, the kind of man who ate the same food as his men, slept in the same mud, faced the same bullets. He never asked his soldiers to do anything he would not do himself, and he never let them face any danger that he was not willing to share. The men would have followed him into hell itself, which, on March 7, 1994, was exactly what they did. Raymond closed his eyes and let the memories wash over him like the rain. He had replayed this night so many times that it had become almost familiar. A wound that never quite healed, but had at least stopped actively bleeding. A scar that ached in the cold and throbbed when he lay awake at 3 in the morning, but no longer threatened to tear him apart with its rawness. The passage of time had not diminished the memory, but it had somehow made it bearable. Most days. The extraction had gone wrong. Everything that could fail had failed, as if Murphy's Law had been written specifically for that night in that jungle, in that country whose name Raymond still could not speak aloud without his voice catching in his throat. Their helicopter took fire 2 miles from the landing zone. The distinctive crack of automatic weapons punching through the thin aluminum skin like needles through paper. The pilot, a 26-year-old warrant officer named Jackson, who had flown more combat missions than men twice his age, tried to climb to gain altitude and distance from the threat. But the damage was too severe. The tail rotor was gone, torn away by a lucky shot from an enemy who would never know how much death and suffering that single bullet would cause. The engine was screaming, metal grinding against metal as components designed to work in harmony tore themselves apart. They went down hard in triple canopy jungle, the kind of dense vegetation that swallowed helicopters and men, and hope without leaving a trace. Deep in territory where American forces officially did not exist, where any rescue would be days away if it came at all, where the enemy knew the terrain and had every advantage. The crash killed the door gunner instantly, a kid from Alabama named Perkins, who had just gotten engaged the week before and had spent the entire flight showing everyone photographs of his fiancée. Broke the co-pilot's neck, a clean death that was the only mercy the universe would offer that night. Left Jackson unconscious and bleeding from a head wound that would kill him within the hour, despite everything the team medic tried to do. 5 men survived the crash. Raymond, 2 other sergeants named Williams and Kowalski, veterans of a dozen operations who had thought they had seen everything until they saw this. A young lieutenant, fresh from the States, whose name Raymond could never allow himself to remember, because remembering his name meant remembering his face. And remembering his face meant remembering the way he died 3 days later in a military hospital, never having regained consciousness. His parents holding his hands as the machines that had been keeping him alive were finally turned off. And Colonel Mercer, who had somehow emerged from the wreckage without a scratch, as if fate had been saving him for something else. They were 40 miles from the nearest friendly position. No radio, destroyed in the crash along with most of their equipment. Limited ammunition, only what they could salvage from the wreckage in the few minutes they had before the enemy arrived. Williams had a shattered femur, white bones showing through torn flesh, his face gray with shock and pain as the medic worked frantically to stabilize him. The lieutenant was going into shock from internal bleeding, his skin turning ashen in the harsh beam of the flashlight, his breath coming in shallow gasps that grew weaker with each passing minute. The enemy was everywhere. They could hear the search parties crashing through the jungle, drawn by the smoke and the sound of the crash like sharks drawn to blood in the water. Whistles shouting in languages none of them spoke, dogs barking in the distance, trained to track American soldiers through the dense vegetation. The sound of vehicles on distant roads, reinforcements being called in to trap whatever had fallen from the sky. Colonel Mercer made the only decision a true leader could make. He gathered them in a tight circle, his voice calm and steady, as if they were discussing training exercises rather than survival, as if the next few minutes would not determine whether they lived or died, whether their families would ever see them again, or would receive instead those folded flags and those empty words of condolence. Williams cannot walk. The lieutenant cannot be moved without killing him. We have perhaps 30 minutes before they reach us, maybe less. Raymond remembered the silence that followed, the weight of understanding settling over them like a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. The mathematics of impossible choices becoming clear to every man in the circle. Not everyone was getting out. Not this time. Someone was going to have to stay behind. You 4 will move east toward the river, Mercer continued. His voice was calm. Raymond had never heard that voice waver in 3 years of operations together. Not once in the most brutal circumstances imaginable. Not when they had been surrounded in a compound in Honduras with ammunition running low and no extraction in sight. Not when they had watched friends die in ways that defied description, ways that haunted Raymond's nightmares to this day. Not when the darkness of what they did threatened to consume whatever light remained in their souls. I will draw their attention west, create noise, buy you time. Raymond had argued. God, how he had argued. His voice cracking with desperation, with the knowledge of what the colonel was proposing, with the certainty that if Harold Mercer walked into that jungle alone, he was never coming out. Sir, we can carry Williams. We can make it together. We do not leave anyone behind. That is what you taught us. That is what we believe. But Mercer simply placed a hand on his shoulder, that same hand that had pulled Raymond from a burning vehicle once before in a dusty town in Central America, whose name he had never learned, and looked into his eyes with that steady gray gaze that seemed to see straight through a man's soul to whatever truth lay hidden there. Sergeant Colton, you have a wife waiting for you in California, Dorothy. She loves you more than you know. A daughter, Emily, who is 12 years old and needs her father to teach her how to ride a bike and help her with her homework and walk her down the aisle someday. Another child on the way that you have not even met yet. You will go home to them. That is an order. It was not a request. It was not a suggestion. It was not open to debate or discussion or the kind of creative reinterpretation that soldiers sometimes applied to orders they did not like. It was an order from a commanding officer who had already made peace with his own death. An order given with the same quiet authority with which Mercer gave every order. The authority of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and why. An order that left no room for argument, even though every fiber of Raymond's being screamed that he should refuse, that he should knock the colonel unconscious and carry him out of the jungle whether he liked it or not, that he should do anything other than what he was being told to do. But he did not refuse, because Harold Mercer had given him an order, and in 30 years of military service, Raymond Colton had never disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer, even when obedience meant living with consequences that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Colonel Harold Mercer drew his sidearm, checked the magazine, chambered around with the smooth efficiency of a man who had performed that action 10,000 times. He took extra magazines from the wounded men, stuffed them into his pockets until they bulged with ammunition. He picked up a rifle from the wreckage and slung it over his shoulder. He collected grenades, anything that would make noise and cause damage and give his men more time. He moved to the edge of the small clearing where the helicopter had come to rest, already calculating angles of fire and avenues of approach, already planning the battle he was about to fight alone. Then he turned back. One last look at the men he was about to die for. "Tell my wife I love her," he said. His voice was steady, but Raymond could see something in his eyes. Not fear. Harold Mercer did not fear death. He had looked death in the face too many times to be afraid of it anymore. Something else. Regret, perhaps, for all the moments he would miss. Pride in the men he had led, the soldiers he had trained, the warriors he was trusting to carry on without him. Love for the family he would never see again. The wife who would become a widow. The daughter who would grow up without a father. "Tell my daughter I am sorry I could not watch her grow up. Tell her that her father died for something that mattered. Tell her to live fully, to love deeply, and to never let fear stop her from becoming who she was meant to be. Tell her I will be watching over her, wherever I am, and that I am proud of her already, even though she is only 4 years old, because I know she is going to grow up to be someone extraordinary." Raymond never saw him again. What he heard 20 minutes later was gunfire. A lot of it. Single shots at first, precise and measured, each one finding its target with the accuracy that came from years of training and combat experience. Colonel Mercer had been one of the best marksmen Raymond had ever seen, and he was demonstrating that skill now in the service of his final mission. Then rapid fire as the enemy realized they were facing something more dangerous than a wounded survivor trying to escape. They were facing a one-man army who had no intention of running, who had positioned himself specifically to draw their attention and keep it, who was willing to delie but determined to take as many of them with him as possible. Then explosions, grenades that Mercer had taken from the wreckage finding their targets. Screams, more gunfire, the sounds of a battle that should have been impossible for one man to wage alone. Then more gunfire, sustained and desperate, as the colonel made his last stand, round after round after round, until the ammunition ran out. Then silence. Colonel Mercer had not just drawn their attention. He had engaged an entire enemy patrol, killed at least 15 by later estimates, based on the intelligence gathered from intercepted radio communications and the bodies that were eventually recovered. He had fought with the fury of a man who knew he was going to die and was determined to take as many of the enemy with him as possible. He had bought his men nearly 2 hours of precious time. 2 hours. The difference between life and death. The difference between Raymond Colton going home to his family and his family receiving a folded flag. Raymond and the others made it to the river, made it across the water cold and fast and deep, William screaming with every jarring step as Kowalski and Raymond carried him between them. Made it to the extraction point the next morning, half dead from exhaustion and blood loss and grief. Made it home. William survived, lost the leg but kept his life, found peace eventually as a counselor for other wounded veterans, turning his own suffering into service, helping others find their way back from the darkness that combat leaves in the soul. Kowalski made it out physically intact but never recovered mentally. He drank too much and slept too little, haunted by the screams of friends who died in the darkness. He took his own life in '99, 5 years after the mission that broke him, another casualty of a war that most Americans would never know was fought. The lieutenant never regained consciousness. His family received a folded flag and a story about a training accident that was not true. Colonel Mercer's body was recovered 3 months later during a covert operation specifically designed to bring him home. They had risked lives to retrieve him because they did not leave anyone behind, not even the dead, not even in countries where they had never officially been. He had taken 11 bullets. The forensics showed he had kept fighting long after any normal man would have fallen, sustained by willpower and determination and love for the men he was protecting. His last magazine was empty. His knife was broken at the blade, evidence of close-quarters combat at the very end. His hands were torn and bloody from fighting hand-to-hand when the ammunition was gone. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously, the highest honor the nation could bestow. Raymond attended the ceremony at the White House, wearing his dress uniform, with the medals he had earned but did not feel he deserved. He watched as the president presented the medal to Mercer's widow, Sarah, a beautiful woman with sad eyes who had aged a decade in the 3 months since her husband's death. She held her 4-year-old daughter's hand throughout the entire ceremony. A daughter named Elena, too young to understand what was happening, too young to remember the father she was losing, but old enough to sense that something precious was being taken from her forever. She stood in her little black dress, looking up at the adults with confused gray eyes that were exactly like her father's, asking questions that no one could answer to her satisfaction. Raymond had made a silent promise that day, a promise to Harold Mercer and to the little girl who would grow up without him, a promise that he would find a way to repay the debt, even though he knew that some debts could never truly be repaid, a promise that Harold's sacrifice would mean something, that it would not be forgotten, that the ripples of his courage would spread outward through time in ways that might one day change lives he could never have imagined. Raymond opened his eyes. The rain had soaked through his coat, plastering his shirt to his skin. He was shivering now, the cold finally penetrating the armor of memory that had protected him from feeling anything while he was lost in the past. But he did not move. Not yet. There was more to say. There was always more to say. "I have been thinking about that debt, Hal," he said to the headstone. 30 years I have been breathing because of what you did. 30 years of watching my children grow into people I am proud of. Emily is 42 now, a doctor. She saves lives every day at the VA hospital, working with veterans who carry wounds that no one can see. Jonathan, the one who was not born yet when you died, he is a prosecutor. Fights for justice in a system that does not always want to give it. Margaret, our youngest, she teaches special education, works with kids that no one else wants to help, the ones society has given up on. He paused, his throat tightened with emotion that 30 years had not diminished. Dorothy is gone. Cancer took her last spring. We had 45 years together, Hal. 45 years of marriage because you gave your life so I could come home to her. I was there when she took her last breath, held her hand the way I could not hold yours, told her I loved her. She said to tell you thank you, said she would see you soon and give you a hug from both of us. The wind picked up. Somewhere in the distance, a flag snapped against its pole, the sound of fabric fighting against the wind, the sound of freedom that men like Harold Mercer had died to protect. I am 70 years old now, Hal, more years behind me than ahead. The children have their own lives scattered across the country, raising families of their own. Grandchildren I barely get to see because everyone is so busy living the lives you made possible. I took a job at Camp Pendleton 6 months ago, civilian advisor. Nothing important. Just wanted to be around young Marines. Wanted to feel useful again. Wanted to stop feeling like I was just waiting to die, just marking time until I could finally set down this weight I have been carrying. His hand was still pressed against the cold marble, that connection to his friend that he renewed every year on this day. I made you a promise, Hal, that night in the jungle, before you walked away. I promised that I would live a life worthy of your sacrifice, that I would honor what you gave me by becoming someone worth dying for. Raymond's voice cracked. 70 years old, survivor of 3 wars and 2 heart attacks and the loss of the woman he loved, and he could still be broken by the memory of a friend's courage. I do not know if I have kept that promise. I have tried. God knows I have tried, raised my children as best I could, loved my wife as completely as I knew how, served my country until they would not let me serve anymore. But some days I wonder if anything I have done could ever be enough to justify what you did for me. He stood there in the rain for a long time, an old man talking to the dead, seeking forgiveness for the sin of survival, seeking absolution that only the dead could grant and that the dead could never speak aloud. When he finally turned to leave, his steps were heavy with the weight of a debt he feared he could never repay. He did not know that fate was about to offer him one final chance. 600 miles away, the California sun beat down on Camp Pendleton with merciless intensity. It was the kind of heat that baked the earth and tested the endurance of even the most hardened Marines, the kind of heat that made men dream of shade and cold water and anywhere that was not here. The Marine Corps base sprawled across 125,000 acres of Southern California coastline, a vast expanse of training grounds and barracks and administrative buildings that housed one of the most effective fighting forces in human history. It was the largest Marine Corps base on the West Coast, home to tens of thousands of active duty personnel, a small city dedicated to the singular purpose of training young men and women to fight and win America's wars. In the medical support building near the eastern edge of the main compound, a woman in faded gray physical training gear was cleaning blood from a treatment table. The work was beneath her training and her abilities and everything she had once been, but that was precisely why she did it. Because it was beneath her, because it required nothing from her except physical presence, because it allowed her to disappear. Her name was Harold Mercer, 34 years old, 5'5", perhaps 120 pounds soaking wet, brown hair pulled back in a tight ponytail that kept it out of her face and made her look plain and forgettable. Face that might have been called ordinary if you did not look closely enough to see the intelligence in her gray eyes, the calculation that never stopped running behind that carefully constructed mask of mediocrity. She moved through the sterile white room with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Every movement calculated to attract no attention. Every gesture designed to suggest competence without excellence. The perfect disguise for someone who wanted to be overlooked. To the Marines who cycled through this building day after day, she was nobody. Just another support staff member. A corpsman, a nurse, someone to fetch bandages and clean up messes and handle the tedious administrative work that combat troops considered beneath their dignity. Someone to be overlooked, dismissed, forgotten before they even left the building. That was exactly what she wanted. That was the point of all of this. Elena wrung out the cleaning cloth and watched the diluted blood swirl down the drain. Pink water disappearing into darkness. A metaphor she tried not to think about too deeply. The Marine who had left this mess had barely acknowledged her existence. 19 years old, built like a Greek god, all muscle and swagger, an invincible youth. Full of the arrogance that military training drilled into young men, the certainty that they were destined for greatness and that everyone around them should recognize that destiny. He had cut his hand during a training exercise. Nothing serious, a laceration across the palm that required 6 stitches. Elena had cleaned the wound, assessed the nerve damage with practice fingers, determined the optimal suture pattern, selected the appropriate thread gauge, and completed the repair in under 4 minutes. The Marine had spent those 4 minutes talking to his buddy about weekend plans. What bars they were going to hit, what women they were going to pursue, what tales of conquest they would have to share on Monday morning. He had not even looked at Elena's face, had not noticed the precision of her work, had not recognized that he was being treated by someone whose medical training had been designed for combat scenarios far more challenging than a cut palm. Elena did not mind. She preferred it this way. The invisibility was a gift she had given herself, a penance she had chosen, a hiding place from a past that she could not face and a future that she no longer wanted. 3 years ago, she had been someone else entirely. Lieutenant Commander Elena Mercer, intelligence analyst for the Joint Special Operations Command, one of the most brilliant tactical minds of her generation, according to the fitness reports that now gathered dust in a classified personnel file somewhere in the Pentagon. She had planned operations that appeared in no official record, coordinated missions that the American public would never know occurred, provided the analysis that sent Tier 1 operators into the most dangerous places on Earth. She had been very, very good at her job. The kind of good that attracted attention and generated opportunities and created a career trajectory that pointed straight toward the highest levels of the intelligence community. Too good perhaps, too confident, too certain that her analysis was correct, that her judgment could be trusted, that the men who risked their lives based on her work would come home safely because she had done everything right. A year and a half ago, a compound in eastern Syria, an operation she had planned down to the smallest detail. The intelligence had indicated a high-value target, a bomb maker responsible for dozens of American casualties over the previous 2 years, a man whose devices had killed Marines and soldiers and civilians across 3 countries, a monster who built instruments of death with the same care that other men applied to building furniture or writing poetry. Elena had analyzed satellite imagery, frame by frame, hour by hour, looking for patterns that others had missed. She had studied intercepted communications, parsing every word for hidden meanings and subtle indicators. She had evaluated human intelligence reports from sources in the field, weighing reliability against urgency, probability against risk. She had been confident, perhaps too confident. She had pushed for the operation to move forward quickly before the target could relocate, before the window of opportunity closed. She had assured her superiors that the intelligence was solid, that the target would be where she said he would be, that the risk was acceptable, and the reward was worth it. The assault team had been 8 operators from SEAL Team 6, the most elite special operations unit in the American military. Men she had worked with for years, men who had trusted her with their lives because she had earned that trust through dozens of successful operations. The insertion went perfectly. The approach went perfectly. The breach went perfectly. What happened next destroyed everything Elena thought she knew about herself. The intelligence was wrong, catastrophically, unforgivably wrong. The target had been moved. In his place was a trap, an ambush designed specifically to kill American special operators, baited with intelligence that had been carefully crafted to appear legitimate. 3 men died in the first 60 seconds. Senior Chief Michael Torres, 34 years old, father of 2 girls ages 7 and 9. He had shown Elena pictures of them just 3 days before the operation, his face glowing with the pride that only fathers know. He had talked about coaching their soccer team when he got home, about the dance recital he was going to miss, about the birthday party he had promised to organize. He died before he could fire a single shot in response to the ambush. Petty Officer First Class Kevin Williams, 29 years old, newlywed. His wife was pregnant with their first child, a boy who would be born 4 months later and never meet his father. Williams died trying to drag Torres to cover, refusing to leave his teammate behind even as the bullets tore through both of them. And Chief Petty Officer James Holloway, 36 years old, the man Elena had been planning to spend the rest of her life with. They had kept their relationship secret as regulations required. No one knew they had been together for nearly 2 years. No one knew about the weekend trips and the quiet dinners and the plans they had made for a future that would now never come. No one knew about the ring James had hidden in his locker, the one he had been planning to give her when he got back from this deployment. James died last of the 3. He survived the initial ambush by pure luck and the instincts that came from years of combat experience. He provided covering fire while his surviving teammates escaped the kill zone. He held his position alone, buying time with his life, buying seconds with bullets until the bullets ran out. He died with his rifle still firing. The last thing he saw was his teammates reaching safety. The last thing he did was exactly what he had been trained to do, put his brothers before himself. Elena had sat in the debrief room afterward and listened as the operation was analyzed second by second. She had watched the footage from helmet cameras, seen the moment the ambush was sprung, heard the screams and the gunfire and the chaos, heard James's voice on the radio, calm and professional, even as he died. She had sat there in her dress uniform with her hands folded in her lap and her face carefully blank and her heart shattering into 1,000 pieces that she was not sure would ever fit back together. The investigation that followed determined that Elena's analysis had been based on information provided by a compromised source, a double agent who had fed false intelligence specifically to set this trap. The source had been trusted for years, had provided accurate information dozens of times, had been vetted and verified and considered reliable by people far more experienced than Elena. The betrayal was sophisticated, calculated, impossible to detect with the methods available. The investigation concluded that no blame should be attached to Lieutenant Commander Mercer, that she had followed proper protocols, that her analysis had been sound based on the information she had available, that the failure was systemic rather than individual. Everyone told her that. Her commanding officers who looked at her with sympathy and offered counseling services. The investigators who documented her work and found nothing to criticize. The surviving operators who knew better than most how intelligence work actually functioned in the real world. None of it mattered. None of it changed anything. None of it brought back the 3 men who had died. None of it gave her back the future she had lost. Elena knew the truth that no investigation could capture and no official finding could absolve. She had been confident, she had pushed for the operation, and 3 men had died because of it. She had requested transfer to medical support within a month. She did not want counseling. She did not want sympathy. She did not want to be told that it was not her fault. She wanted penance. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to become so small and so invisible that even her guilt could not find her anymore. So here she was, cleaning blood from treatment tables in a building where no one knew her real name, stitching wounds for Marines who did not know they were being treated by someone who had once commanded the respect of the most elite warriors in the American military. Hiding from a past she could not change and a future she no longer wanted to see. The door to the medical building opened. Elena did not turn around. She had learned to identify people by their footsteps, by the weight of their tread, by the rhythm of their movement. This was someone older, someone who moved with military precision despite the civilian clothes she could hear rustling, someone who had been trained in the same schools of movement that she had attended. Lieutenant Commander Mercer. The voice stopped her cold. No one called her by that rank here. No one knew that rank existed. She had buried it along with everything else when she requested this assignment. Elena turned slowly. An old man stood in the doorway. 70 years old if she had to guess. Civilian clothes but military bearing that no amount of retirement could erase. Eyes that held the particular exhaustion of a man who had seen too much and carried too much for too long. "I think you have the wrong person," Elena said carefully, her voice neutral, her face blank, the mask she had perfected over the past year and a half firmly in place. "My name is Elena Grant. I am a civilian contractor." The old man smiled, a sad smile that held recognition and understanding and something that looked almost like compassion. "Your name is Elena Mercer. You are the daughter of Colonel Harold James Mercer, Medal of Honor recipient, killed in action on March 7th, 1994. Elena's heart stopped. "You have his eyes," the old man continued. "That same gray, that same stillness, that same way of looking at the world as if you are calculating distances and angles and probabilities. I would recognize those eyes anywhere. I saw them every day for 3 years, and I have seen them in my dreams for 30 years since." He took a step forward. "My name is Raymond Colton. I served under your father in special operations, and I am standing here today because 30 years ago, he walked into the jungle alone so that I could live." Elena could not move, could not breathe, could not process what she was hearing. 30 years of distance collapsed in an instant. The father she barely remembered, whose face she knew only from photographs and whose voice she could not recall, no matter how hard she tried. The hero whose shadow she had lived under her entire life, whose sacrifice had shaped her mother's grief and her own choices and everything that had led her to this moment. "How did you find me?" Elena finally managed. "I did not find you. I was assigned here 6 months ago as a civilian advisor. When I saw you last week, something about the way you moved reminded me of someone. The way you scan a room when you enter. The way your eyes track movement constantly, cataloging threats and exits and defensive positions. Those are not habits a medical contractor develops. Those are instincts drilled into someone by very specialized training. Many people have those habits. True, but then I heard you talking in your sleep, in the break room, during your overnight shift. A code phrase, red gold. The words hit Elena like physical blows. Red gold, the designation for JSOC intelligence personnel with the highest clearance levels. A phrase she had not spoken aloud in over a year. A phrase that should never have crossed her lips, not even in sleep. That phrase means nothing to most people, Raymond said. But I made some inquiries. Careful inquiries, through channels that still remember my name. And I discovered that there was a Lieutenant Commander, Elena Mercer, who served with JSOC, whose personnel file was suddenly modified around the same time an operation in Syria went wrong, whose career trajectory changed from vertical to invisible in the space of a few weeks. Elena's legs felt weak. She reached for the treatment table to steady herself. I found your next of kin listing, Raymond continued. Father's name, Colonel Harold James Mercer. They stood perhaps 6 feet apart now, two strangers connected by blood and sacrifice, and the strange mathematics of war that brought people together across decades and distances. You knew him? Elena said, a statement, not a question. I knew him better than I knew my own brothers. 3 years of operations together, fighting together, bleeding together, watching men die together. That creates a bond that civilian life cannot replicate. That creates something that lasts beyond death. Tell me about him. The words came out before Elena could stop them. Growing up, her mother had rarely spoken about Harold Mercer. The grief was too deep. The loss was too profound. And after her mother's death, when Elena was 23, there had been no one left to ask. No one who had known her father as a man rather than as a name on a medal citation. Raymond's face softened. Something in his eyes changed, became warmer, became human in a way that military bearing usually concealed. He was the finest officer I ever served under, and I served under many over 20 years of special operations. Most officers kept their distance from enlisted men, maintained the hierarchy, but your father would sit with us at night after the missions were done, share our food, learn our names, know our families. Elena sank into a chair. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the sterile white floor. He knew my wife was expecting our second child, asked me every week if I had received letters from home. When my son was born, he found a bottle of champagne somewhere and made everyone toast to fatherhood, even though we were in the middle of a jungle where champagne had no business being. Raymond's eyes were distant now, seeing something 30 years away. He never raised his voice, never needed to. When he gave an order, you obeyed not because you feared punishment, but because you trusted him completely. He had this way of looking at you like he could see exactly who you were. All your fear, all your doubt, and he accepted it. Made you feel like your fear was natural, but your courage was what mattered. Elena thought of the way James had looked at her. The same steady acceptance. The same ability to see past the surface to whatever truth lay beneath. On the night he died, Raymond said, his voice dropping lower, weighted with 30 years of grief that had never fully healed. We were trapped, 40 miles from safety, enemy everywhere. 2 men badly wounded. He was staring at his hands now. Old hands, scarred hands, hands that had carried rifles and helped wounded comrades and held the photograph of a man who had died saving his life. He did not hesitate, just told us the plan. He would go west, draw their attention. We would go east. Raymond looked up. His eyes were wet. I argued with him, begged him to let me go instead. Told him I was just a sergeant, that the mission needed him, that my life was not worth his. But he just put his hand on my shoulder and told me I had a family waiting, a wife and a daughter who needed me. Elena felt tears spilling down her cheeks. She did not try to stop them. He walked into that jungle alone, knowing he would die, and he did it with the same calm he brought to everything else. Like it was just another mission, like his own life was just another asset to be deployed in service of the objective. The old man fell silent. The only sound was the distant hum of air conditioning and the muffled noise of Marines passing outside the building. For 30 years, Raymond finally said, I have carried a debt I could never repay. Every good thing in my life, every moment of joy, every breath I have taken exists because your father sacrificed his. Not a day has gone by that I have not thought about him. Not a night has passed that I have not seen his face in my dreams. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. And for 30 years, I have been looking for a way to honor that sacrifice. to prove that his death meant something, that the gift he gave me was not wasted. Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Why are you telling me this? Because I finally understand what I am supposed to do. When I realized who you were, when I understood that Colonel Mercer's daughter was hiding herself away in this building, punishing herself for something that was not her fault, something clicked into place, something that felt like fate. He stood up slowly, his old joints protesting the movement. Your father saved my life so I could live, really live, not just breathe and eat and sleep, but live with purpose and meaning and joy. But you are not living, Elena. You are hiding, punishing yourself for something that was not your fault. You do not know what happened. I know enough. I know that an operation went wrong. I know that men died. I know that you blame yourself, even though no one else does. They should. The investigation said otherwise. The investigation was wrong. Raymond studied her for a long moment. The investigation looked at evidence. You are looking at grief. They are not the same thing. Elena stood up sharply, anger flashing through her for the first time since he had entered the room. But Raymond caught her arm, gently, the touch of a grandfather rather than a soldier. Your father did not die so his daughter could spend her life in purgatory. He died because he believed some things are worth dying for. And I believe one of those things was the hope that the people he loved would live fully, would embrace life, would honor his sacrifice by becoming everything they were meant to be. Elena was shaking now, the walls she had built around herself cracking under the weight of this old man's words. I cannot, she whispered. Every time I try to trust myself, I see their faces. Michael, Kevin, James, I hear the gunfire, and I know that my confidence killed them. Raymond pulled her into an embrace, an old man holding a broken woman, two strangers bound by blood and sacrifice in the strange ways that war connects people across generations. I watched your father walk to his death, Raymond said softly. I have seen his face in my dreams every night since. The guilt never goes away, Elena. You cannot make it disappear, but it can become something else. It can become motivation, purpose, a reason to live better than you would have otherwise. Elena sobbed against his shoulder, all the grief she had refused to feel for the past year and a half finally breaking free. When the tears finally subsided, Elena pulled back. Her eyes were red, her face was blotched, but something had shifted in her expression. Something that had been locked away was beginning to unlock. What do you want from me? Raymond smiled, the same sad smile he had worn when he first entered the room. I want to repay my debt to your father. I could not save him, but maybe I can help save his daughter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn photograph, handled it with the reverence of a religious artifact, handed it to Elena with hands that trembled slightly. A young man in military fatigues, maybe 40 years old, eyes that looked directly at the camera with quiet confidence. A face that was strong but kind, a face that Elena had seen in photographs her whole life, but had never seen animated by stories, by memories, by the love of someone who had known him. Her father, young and alive and confident, before the jungle, before the sacrifice, before everything. I have carried that photograph for 30 years, Raymond said. He gave it to me the day before he died, asked me to send it to his wife and daughter if anything happened to him. I never could. It was all I had left of him. Elena traced her father's face with her fingertip. This man had died when she was 4 years old. She had no real memories of him, just stories that her mother had been too sad to tell, and a Medal of Honor in a display case that she had never been able to look at without crying. Your father did not walk into that jungle so I could follow him into the dark, Raymond said. He walked into that jungle so I could walk into the light. Every day I lived after that, every good thing I did, every moment of joy I experienced, that was how I honored him. Not with guilt, not with punishment, with life. He placed his weathered hand over hers, both of them touching the photograph of a man who had shaped both their lives in ways he could never have imagined. If I help you find your way back to who you are supposed to be, then your father's sacrifice means something. His death created life, my life first, and now maybe yours. Elena stood there in the fading sunlight, holding her father's photograph. She did not know if she believed him, did not know if the person she had been could ever return, did not know if she even wanted to be that person again, given what that person had done. But for the first time in a year and a half, she felt something besides pain. She felt hope, fragile, uncertain, barely there, but present. "Okay," she said softly, "one day at a time." Raymond squeezed her hands. His grip was warm, despite the cold marble he had been touching just hours ago in Arlington. "That is all any of us can do, one day at a time, one step at a time out of the darkness." The sun sank below the horizon. Night fell over Camp Pendleton, and two people connected by blood and sacrifice began the long journey toward healing. Neither of them knew what challenges lay ahead. Neither could imagine the tests that fate had in store for them. But they had taken the first step, and sometimes that first step is all that matters. 3 weeks had passed since Raymond Colton walked into the medical building and changed Elena Mercer's life forever. The California sun continued its daily assault on Camp Pendleton, baking the parade grounds and testing the endurance of thousands of Marines who trained beneath its unforgiving glare. The base hummed with the constant rhythm of military life, a symphony of controlled violence and disciplined preparation that never stopped, never slowed, never acknowledged weakness or exhaustion. Helicopters thundered overhead, their rotors chopping the air into submission as they carried young warriors to training exercises that would prepare them for wars they could not yet imagine. Drill instructors screamed at recruits until their voices cracked and their faces turned crimson. Because fear of a drill instructor was nothing compared to the fear of failing your brothers in combat. Convoys of vehicles rumbled toward distant training areas, carrying young men and women into the crucible that would forge them into something stronger than they had ever believed possible. In the center of this controlled chaos stood a man who seemed to embody everything the Marine Corps valued. Captain Dalton Hayes, 38 years old, 6 feet 2 inches of solid muscle, 220 pounds of disciplined aggression packed onto a frame that had been sculpted through years of obsessive dedication. A jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite by a sculptor who believed that softness was weakness. A voice that could cut through a firefight and make grown men flinch. His uniform was always perfect, creased in exactly the right places, bearing the ribbons and insignia of a career dedicated to physical excellence. His bearing was always impeccable, the posture of a man who had been told since childhood that slouching was for people who had already given up. His presence commanded attention without requiring a single word, demanding respect through sheer force of will and physical dominance. He stood at the edge of the main training field, watching a platoon of young Marines struggle through an obstacle course that he had designed to be punishing. His arms were crossed over his chest, forearms thick with corded muscle that rippled when he moved. His expression was one of practiced contempt, the kind of look that superior officers develop to keep subordinates appropriately fearful and motivated. To the Marines under his command, Captain Hayes was the embodiment of military excellence. He had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, facing the Taliban in the mountains and valleys of a country that had broken empires for thousands of years. He had the medals to prove his courage, including a Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts, evidence that he had bled for his country and kept fighting. He had the physique to prove his dedication, the result of 2 hours in the gym every morning before dawn, pushing his body to limits that most men could not imagine. He was everything a Marine officer was supposed to be, the recruiting poster come to life, the ideal made flesh. What they did not know, what no one was allowed to know, was that Dalton Hayes was terrified. Not of combat, not of death, not of any external enemy that could be faced with a rifle and determination and the warrior spirit that had been drilled into him since he was old enough to understand what his father's medals meant. Dalton Hayes was terrified of his own inadequacy, terrified that beneath the muscles and the medals and the carefully cultivated reputation for excellence, there was nothing but a frightened boy who had never been good enough and never would be. The fear had lived inside him for as long as he could remember. It had taken root in his chest when he was 7 years old, the day 2 Marines in dress uniforms knocked on his mother's door in their small house in Jacksonville, North Carolina. He remembered the sound of the doorbell, 2 quick chimes that would echo in his nightmares for decades. Remembered the way his mother's face changed when she saw who was standing on the porch, the color draining from her cheeks as if someone had opened a valve and let her blood run out onto the floor. Remembered the silence that fell over the house like a shroud, a silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Gunnery Sergeant William Hayes would not be coming home. November 13th, 2004, Fallujah. Dalton's father had died in the second battle for that hellish city, the largest urban combat operation since the Tet Offensive in 1968. House to house, room to room, The kind of fighting that turned men into statistics and statistics into headlines that Americans read over breakfast before turning to the sports section and forgetting that a war was being fought in their name. William Hayes had died leading his squad through an ambush that should have killed them all. The enemy had been waiting with prepared positions, overlapping fields of fire that created a kill zone from which there was no escape by any conventional tactical doctrine. A trap designed by men who had been fighting invaders for generations, who knew that American soldiers would never abandon their wounded, who used that loyalty as a weapon. But William Hayes had found a way. He had recognized the trap a split second before it closed, some combination of instinct and experience, and the sixth sense that combat veterans develop if they live long enough. He had screamed for his men to take cover while he charged directly into the enemy position, a one-man assault that violated every principle of tactical warfare except the most important one: protect your brothers at any cost. He had drawn their fire, become the target, absorbed the rounds that were meant for the 12 men behind him, bought his squad the seconds they needed to find protection and return fire. He had held off an entire enemy position with nothing but his rifle and his courage and a determination that refused to acknowledge the impossibility of what he was doing. He had fought until his ammunition ran out and then fought with his hands. He had died the way warriors are supposed to die, standing between his brothers and those who would destroy them. 12 men survived that ambush because of William Hayes. 12 families remained whole. 12 futures remained possible. He was awarded the Navy Cross posthumously, the second highest valor award in the military, one step below the Medal of Honor. The citation described his actions as extraordinary heroism and selfless sacrifice beyond the call of duty, words that tried to capture something that words could never fully express. Dalton had been 7 years old when he learned what those words meant. He had stood beside his mother at the funeral, wearing a suit that was too big for him because no one had thought to take him shopping for clothes that fit, watching as Marines in perfect formation raised their rifles to the gray November sky. 3 volleys, 21 guns, the sound of honor rendered in gunpowder and grief. A folded flag was placed in his mother's hands, a flag that now sat in a display case in Dalton's own quarters, next to the Navy Cross that his mother had given him when he received his commission, next to the photograph of a father he could barely remember, but had spent his entire life trying to become. From that moment forward, Dalton Hayes had known exactly what he had to become. He had to be worthy of his father's sacrifice. He had to prove that William Hayes had not died for nothing. He had to become a hero. There was no other acceptable option. The problem was that heroism could not be forced. Courage could not be manufactured in a gym or earned through promotions. Sacrifice could not be scheduled or planned or prepared for like an evaluation board. 3 tours in Afghanistan, and Dalton had never faced a moment like his father had faced. He had been in combat. He had fought. He had killed. But he had never been tested the way William Hayes had been tested. Never faced a moment that demanded everything he had and then demanded more. Never had the chance to prove that he was worthy of the name he carried. And so Dalton had done what many men in his position do. He had sought out the visible markers of strength, the measurable indicators of worth that could be displayed and compared and used to establish dominance. He had built his body into a weapon, sculpting muscle upon muscle until he was one of the strongest men on any base where he served. He had mastered every combat skill the Marine Corps could teach him, earning qualifications and certifications that filled an entire page of his personnel file. He had collected medals and commendations and promotions, evidence that the institution recognized his excellence even if he could not recognize it himself. But none of it was ever enough. Because deep inside, in the place where a 7-year-old boy still stood beside his mother's black dress, Dalton knew the truth. He had never been tested. Not really. Not the way that mattered. And until that test came, until he faced his own Fallujah and proved himself worthy, he would never escape the fear that maybe he was not his father's son after all. Maybe he was just a pretender wearing a dead man's legacy like a costume. And the fear of that inadequacy had curdled into something else over the years. Something harder, something meaner, something that demanded expression in ways that Dalton did not fully understand or control. It had become anger, an anger that he directed outward, at those he perceived as weak, at those who reminded him of the weakness he feared lived inside himself. An anger that made him feel strong because it gave him power over others. An anger that masked the terrified child who still wondered if he would have run when his father charged forward. or if he would have found the courage to follow. Dalton watched a young Marine fall from the rope climb and crash onto the sand below. The recruit lay there for a moment, gasping, before struggling back to his feet with the determination that the Corps tried to instill in every man and woman who earned the title Marine. "Torres!" Dalton's voice cracked like a whip across the training field, cutting through the ambient noise of the obstacle course. "Did I give you permission to rest?" Private First Class Marcus Torres looked up at his commanding officer. 19 years old, lean and wiry, with the body of a distance runner rather than a weightlifter. Dark eyes that held something beyond the usual recruit nervousness, something that looked almost like defiance. A jaw set in a way that suggested he was holding back words that would get him in serious trouble. "No, sir," Torres said. His voice was steady despite his obvious exhaustion, despite the sand in his hair and the blood on his palms from the rough rope. "Then get back on that rope. You do not stop until I tell you to stop. You do not fall until I give you permission to fall. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." Torres attacked the rope again. His arms were trembling with the accumulated fatigue of hours of training. His hands were raw and bleeding, skin torn away by the rough fibers. But he climbed, because that was what Marines did. They climbed until they could not climb anymore, and then they found a way to climb a little further. Dalton watched the young man struggle with a mixture of approval and something that might have been recognition. There was something familiar about Torres, something in the way he pushed through pain that spoke of experience beyond his years. Something in the anger that burned behind his eyes like banked coals waiting for fuel. Dalton did not know it yet, but he was looking at a mirror, a younger version of himself, another son trying desperately to be worthy of a dead father's sacrifice. Another boy transformed into a weapon by grief he did not know how to process. The connection would not become clear for weeks, but the seeds of understanding were already being planted in the hard soil of Camp Pendleton, waiting for the rain that would help them grow. Marcus Torres had been born angry. At least that was how it felt to him. For as long as he could remember, there had been a fire burning in his chest, a constant heat that demanded action, that refused to be satisfied, that pushed him forward even when his body begged him to stop. The fire had been there before he understood what fire was, before he had words to describe the feeling that made him different from the other children, the feeling that made him dangerous. His mother said he had been a difficult baby, always crying, never sleeping, fighting against the world from his first breath, as if he knew even then that the world was something to be fought. The doctors had called it colic, that catch-all diagnosis for babies who would not stop screaming. His grandmother had called it spirit, recognizing something in the infant that she had seen before in other members of the family. His father had called it potential. Staff Sergeant Antonio Torres had been a quiet man, not silent, not withdrawn, but economical with his words in a way that made each word carry weight. He spoke when he had something worth saying and remained still when he did not, a quality that had served him well in the Army and that Marcus had never been able to emulate. Antonio had spent 20 years in the Army, including 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the most elite light infantry units in the American military. He had come home with the particular stillness that combat veterans carry like invisible armor, a stillness that protected them from the chaos of civilian life, even as it separated them from the people who loved them. But Antonio had always made time for Marcus, even when the nightmares came, waking him in the middle of the night with screams that he could not remember making. Even when the drinking started, a slow slide into self-medication that the VA would later call self-destructive behavior, and that Antonio called the only way to sleep. Even when the darkness of what he had seen overseas began to eclipse the brightness of his life at home, Antonio Torres would sit with his son in the backyard of their small house in San Antonio, Texas. The stars would wheel overhead, countless points of light in the endless dark, and Antonio would tell stories. Not about combat, never about the things that woke him screaming, but about the men he had served with, the brothers he had found in the chaos of war, the bonds that formed when people faced death together and somehow survived. The anger you feel, Antonio had told his son once, on a night when Marcus had come home with bloody knuckles from a fight at school that he had started and finished with brutal efficiency. It is not a weakness, it is fuel. The question is what you burn it for. Marcus had been 13 years old when the fuel ran out for his father, April 17, 2019. A Tuesday. An ordinary day that became the dividing line in Marcus's life, the boundary between everything before and everything after. A day that changed him in ways he was still discovering. He came home from school to find police cars in the driveway, their lights flashing blue and red against the white walls of the house, their sirens silent in a way that was somehow worse than any noise could have been. The neighbors were standing on their lawns, watching with the terrible fascination that tragedy always attracts. His mother was on the front porch, being held upright by a neighbor because her legs would not support her weight. She was making sounds that Marcus had never heard from a human being, sounds that did not have words, sounds that came from somewhere beyond language and reason and sanity. Staff Sergeant Antonio Torres, veteran of 2 combat tours, recipient of the Bronze Star with Valor, beloved husband and father, had died by his own hand in the garage of his family home. The official cause was listed as suicide. The real cause was a war that had followed him home across 10,000 miles of ocean and desert. A war that lived inside his head where no one could fight it with him. A war that could not be won with rifles and courage and the warrior spirit that had kept him alive overseas. 22 veterans die by suicide every day in the United States. 22, a number that loses meaning through repetition, that becomes just another statistic in a country that has grown numb to statistics. A number that represents an epidemic of grief that most Americans prefer not to think about. Antonio Torres became one of those 22 on a Tuesday in April, and his son Marcus became one of the thousands of children left behind to make sense of a loss that defies sense, to find meaning in a death that seems to have no meaning at all. Marcus had been angry before that day. After that day, he was consumed. The fire that had always burned in his chest became an inferno that threatened to destroy everything it touched. He fought at school, sending 2 other students to the hospital with injuries that should have resulted in criminal charges, but were quietly dismissed because of his father's service. He fought in the streets, seeking out anyone who looked at him wrong, anyone who seemed to be living a life unburdened by the grief that Marcus carried everywhere. He fought with his mother, who was drowning in her own loss and could not reach her son no matter how hard she tried. He fought because fighting was the only thing that made the pain stop. When his fists were flying, when his blood was pumping, when the world narrowed to the simple mathematics of violence, Marcus did not have to think about the garage, about the silence, about the sounds his mother made on the porch, about the father who had survived 2 wars only to lose the battle that no one could see. By the time he was 17, Marcus Torres had been arrested twice for assault. His grades had collapsed. His future had narrowed to a few unpleasant possibilities, none of which honored the father who had given everything to his country. It was a judge who saved him, an older man named Henderson who had served in Desert Storm and recognized something in the angry young man standing before his bench. Instead of juvenile detention, he offered Marcus a choice: enlist or incarceration. Become something or become nothing. Marcus chose the Marines. He told himself it was because the Marine Corps was the toughest branch, the most demanding, the one that would burn away everything soft and weak and leave only steel behind. He told himself he wanted to be forged in the same fires that had shaped the men his father had served with, the brothers who had meant more to Antonio than anything except his family. The truth was simpler and more painful. His father had been a soldier. By becoming a Marine, Marcus was trying to understand the man who had left him, trying to walk the same path, trying to find the missing piece that would explain why his father had been able to face death overseas but could not face life at home. 2 years into his enlistment, Marcus Torres was still searching, still angry, still burning with a fire that no amount of physical training could extinguish. He had found temporary outlets for his rage. The brutal physical training helped, gave him something to fight against that would not land him in the brig. The structured discipline helped, imposed order on a chaos that threatened to tear him apart. The sense of belonging to something larger than himself helped, gave him brothers who would never understand his pain, but who would stand beside him anyway. But the fire never went out. It just learned to hide, learned to wait, learned to express itself in ways that were acceptable within the rigid hierarchy of military life. And sometimes when he saw weakness in others, the fire would flare up. The anger would demand expression, and Marcus would become someone his father would not have recognized, someone cruel. This was why Marcus Torres had become one of the Marines who mocked Harold Mercer. Not because he truly thought less of her, not because he believed she was worthless or deserved contempt. But because mocking others made him feel strong, and feeling strong was the only way to keep the fire from consuming him entirely. Raymond Colton had spent 30 years learning to read men. In the jungles of Central America, that skill had kept him alive when everything else suggested he should be dead. He had learned to recognize the subtle signs of an ambush, the way birds went silent before danger, the way the air itself seemed to thicken with menace. He had learned to read the faces of his enemies, to anticipate their movements, to know when they would attack and when they would retreat. Later, in civilian life, the skill had served him differently. He had learned to see the pain behind people's masks, the fear beneath their anger, the loneliness that drove them to terrible choices. He had used this ability in his work as a counselor at the VA hospital, helping veterans find their way back from the darkness that combat left inside them. Now at 70 years old, Raymond watched the young Marines of Camp Pendleton with the patient attention of a naturalist studying wildlife in their natural habitat. He saw things that others missed, patterns that others ignored, truths that others did not want to acknowledge. He saw Captain Dalton Hayes, and he recognized the particular arrogance that masks deep insecurity. He had known officers like Hayes in his own service, men who built walls of muscle and bravado to hide the frightened boys within. They were not evil, they were damaged. And damaged men often did damage to others without even realizing it, passing on their pain like a virus that had no cure. He saw Private Marcus Torres, and he recognized something else entirely. The young man's anger was so bright it was almost visible, a heat shimmer around his lean frame that others seemed to feel even if they could not see it. But beneath the anger, Raymond saw grief, the specific, corrosive grief of a child who has lost a parent too soon and never learned how to process the loss. Raymond knew that grief intimately. He had carried it for 30 years, had learned to live with it the way a man learns to live with a missing limb. The grief of surviving when others did not. The grief of a debt that could never be repaid. And he saw Elena Mercer, watching her from a careful distance over the weeks that followed their first meeting. He saw her going through the motions of her diminished life, cleaning treatment tables and organizing supplies and tending to Marines who barely acknowledged her existence. He saw the ghost of who she had been hovering around her like an afterimage, the brilliant intelligence officer obscured but not destroyed by guilt. But he also saw something changing, small shifts in her posture, moments when she stood a little straighter, times when her eyes would lift from the ground and scan the horizon, the way they used to scan tactical displays for threats and opportunities. Flickers of the woman she had been before guilt had buried her alive. Their conversations had become a regular occurrence. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that a rhythm had developed between them. They would find each other in quiet moments, the mess hall during off hours, when the tables were empty and they could talk without being overheard. The benches near the medical building after sunset, watching the California sky turn colors that no artist could capture. The memorial garden where Camp Pendleton honored its fallen, surrounded by the names of men who had given everything. Raymond told her stories about her father, not the official stories, the ones captured in medal citations and military records in the formal language of bureaucracy. The real stories, the human ones, the stories that made Harold Mercer a man instead of a legend. He told her about this time her father had carried a wounded man for 6 miles through enemy territory, refusing all offers of help because he had promised that man he would get him home. He told her about the letters Harold wrote to his wife and daughter, letters filled with longing and love, and an aching desire to be present for the life he was missing. Raymond had seen some of those letters, had watched Harold writing them by flashlight in foxholes, had understood that for Harold, those letters were prayers to a family he might never see again. He told her about the quiet moments between missions, when Harold would talk about his dreams for the future. A small house somewhere peaceful, away from the chaos of military life. A garden where he could grow tomatoes and teach his daughter about patience and nurturing. A life where the biggest challenge was keeping up with a daughter who was growing too fast. Elena absorbed these stories like rain falling on parched earth. Each one added color and dimension to the ghost she had grown up with. Each one transformed her father from a name on a medal into a man who had laughed and dreamed and loved. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after their first meeting. Elena found Raymond sitting on a bench overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The sun was setting, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson and deep purple that seemed too beautiful to be real. The air smelled of salt and the distant memory of storms that had passed and storms that were yet to come. She sat down beside him without speaking. For a long time, they watched the sun sink toward the horizon in comfortable silence. Two people who had learned that sometimes the best communication happens in the spaces between words. "I have been thinking about what you said," Elena finally offered. Her voice was soft, almost lost in the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below. "About honoring sacrifice by living fully." Raymond nodded but did not respond. He had learned long ago that silence often drew out more truth than questions ever could. "I do not know how to do that," Elena continued. "I have spent the past year and a half trying to disappear, trying to make myself small enough that the guilt cannot find me. But it always finds me, no matter how invisible I become." "Guilt is persistent," Raymond agreed. "It does not care how small you make yourself. It will shrink to fit." Elena turned to look at them. In the fading light, her gray eyes caught the sunset and seemed to glow with colors that had nothing to do with the sky. "How do you live with it? 30 years of knowing that someone died so you could live. How do you carry that weight without being crushed?" Raymond was quiet for a long moment. This was the question he had been waiting for, the question that mattered. "At first, I did not carry it well," he admitted. "I came home from that mission and I drank. I raged. I pushed away everyone who tried to help me, including my wife, Dorothy. God rest her soul, she stayed with me through things that would have justified leaving, things I am not proud of." He paused, gathering memories that he rarely shared with anyone. "There was a night, maybe 2 years after that operation, when I sat in my garage with my service pistol in my hands. I had convinced myself that dying would honor Harold's sacrifice, that living was somehow disrespectful to what he had done, that I should have been the one to walk into that jungle." Elena's breath caught. The mention of suicide struck too close to wounds that had never fully healed, too close to the garage in San Antonio that she knew nothing about but that Marcus Torres thought about every day. "What stopped you?" she whispered. "Dorothy," Raymond said simply. "She came into the garage looking for a screwdriver, some home repair project that could not wait until morning. Found me sitting there in the dark with the gun. She did not scream, did not cry. She just sat down next to me and took my hand." He smiled at the memory, a sad smile but genuine. "She said something that changed everything. She said that dying would not honor Harold's sacrifice. It would waste it. She said that Harold had given me a gift, the gift of life, and throwing that gift away was the greatest disrespect I could offer to a man who had died so I could live." Raymond turned to face Elena directly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that seemed to transcend the fading light. "She was right. Your father did not walk into that jungle so I could follow him into the dark. He walked into that jungle so I could walk into the light. Every day I lived after that, every good thing I did, every moment of joy I experienced, that was how I honored him. Not with guilt, not with punishment, with life." Elena's eyes were wet. The sunset cast long shadows across her face, painting her features in shades of gold and shadow. "It is not the same," she said. "My father chose to die for you. The men I lost, they did not choose anything. They trusted me, and I got them killed." "Did you pull the trigger?" "What? Did you personally pull the trigger that killed those men? Did you set the ambush? Did you betray them to the enemy?" "No, but You made a decision based on the best information available. Information that was poisoned by someone else's betrayal. The failure was not yours, Elena. It was the system's. It was the enemy's. It was the double agent who fed you lies that had been specifically designed to be undetectable. I should have known. I should have seen something." "Should have what? Been able to see through a deception that fooled everyone in the intelligence community? Been somehow immune to lies that had been carefully crafted over years to appear legitimate?" Raymond reached out and took her hand. His grip was gentle but firm. "Listen to me carefully, Elena. I have made decisions that cost men their lives. Real decisions. Decisions where I knew the risk and took it anyway because the mission demanded it. And I have spent 30 years learning to live with the weight of those choices." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "What you are carrying is not the weight of your decisions. It is the weight of grief that has nowhere else to go. You loved one of those men who died. You cannot grieve for him properly because the guilt has convinced you that you do not deserve to grieve. So the grief has transformed into something else, something that eats at you from the inside." Elena was crying now, tears streaming down her face in the fading light, tears she had refused to shed for over a year. She did not try to wipe them away. "His name was James," she said. The words came out broken, fragmented, pieces of a story she had never told anyone. "James Holloway, we were going to get married. We were going to have a life together. And now he is gone, and I do not know how to want anything anymore." Raymond pulled her into an embrace, the same embrace he had offered 3 weeks ago, the same patient strength, the same willingness to hold space for her pain without trying to fix it or minimize it or make it go away. "Then we start there," he said softly. "Not with guilt, not with punishment, with grief. Let yourself mourn the man you loved. Let yourself feel the loss without turning it into blame. That is where healing begins." They sat there as the sun finished its descent and the stars began to emerge. An old man and a broken woman, two survivors bound by blood and history, beginning the slow work of resurrection. The following week brought a revelation that would bind their stories even tighter. It happened in the base library, a quiet building that most Marines ignored in favor of the gym or the recreation center. Raymond had taken to spending afternoons there, reading old books and avoiding the heat, enjoying the silence that was so rare in a place dedicated to controlled violence. Elena had begun joining him occasionally, sitting across the table with her own reading material, sharing the comfortable silence that had developed between them. Neither of them needed to speak to feel the connection that Harold Mercer's sacrifice had created. On this particular afternoon, Raymond was reviewing some old military records he had requested through official channels. Research for a project he had been contemplating, a written history of special operations that might help future generations understand what men like Harold Mercer had done in the shadows. Elena noticed the photographs spread across the table, black and white images from decades past, young men in military fatigues, faces that belonged to a different era of warfare. Her father's unit. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the photographs. Raymond nodded and slid them across the table. Elena studied each image carefully, searching for the father she barely remembered in the faces of young men frozen forever in moments of youth and possibility. Her father appeared in several of them, always calm, always steady, always with that same quiet confidence that Raymond had described. But there were other faces too, other young men whose stories she did not know. "Who is this?" Elena asked, pointing to a photograph of 3 men standing together. Her father was in the center, his arm around the shoulders of his companions. On his left was a younger Raymond, barely recognizable beneath the youth and the fear that combat had not yet fully erased. And on her father's right was a third man, tall and lean, with dark features and a smile that seemed to challenge the camera to capture his spirit. "That was Miguel Torres," Raymond said. His voice had changed, become heavier with memory and loss. "One of the best soldiers I ever served with. Your father and Miguel were close. They came up through the ranks together, watched each other's backs through 3 years of the most dangerous operations the military had to offer." Torres. The name caught Elena's attention. Private Marcus Torres, the young Marine who had mocked her, the angry boy with the dead eyes. "Torres," she repeated. "There is a Private Torres on this base. I have treated him several times." Raymond nodded slowly. Something in his expression shifted, a recognition of connections that he had not fully explored but was beginning to suspect. "Miguel had a son," Raymond said. "Antonio. I met him once, years after those operations ended. He grew up to join the Army. Rangers, I believe. Served in Afghanistan." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the library's air conditioning. "Antonio Torres," she said. "Staff Sergeant Antonio Torres." Raymond looked up sharply. "You know that name?" "I knew his son, Michael Torres, Senior Chief, SEAL Team 6. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an explosion, spreading outward to reveal the shape of something terrible and connected. The library seemed to contract around them, the world narrowing to this single impossible connection that spanned generations. "Michael Torres was one of the men who died in Syria," Elena continued. Her voice was barely audible, barely more than a breath-given shape. "One of the 3 men who died in the ambush. I have been carrying his death for over a year." Raymond's face had gone pale. His hands, normally so steady from decades of training, trembled against the table. "Miguel Torres served with your father," he said slowly, working through the implications. "Miguel's son was Antonio. Antonio's son was Michael, and Michael died because of intelligence that you provided." "Yes. And there is a Private Torres on this base who—" "Marcus Torres. 19 years old. He enlisted after his father died, after Antonio Torres died. Raymond closed his eyes. The weight of generations pressed down on both of them, a burden of interconnected tragedy that seemed too heavy for any two people to carry. 3 generations, Raymond whispered. Miguel, Antonio, Michael, all connected to the same legacy of service that took your father, all part of the same terrible story of sacrifice and loss. Elena stared at the photograph in her hands. 3 men smiling at the camera, unaware of the futures that awaited them. Her father, a young Raymond, and Miguel Torres, whose grandson had died under her command, whose great-grandson was now serving on the same base where she had come to hide from her guilt. When Raymond finally assembled the complete picture through days of careful research, he sat alone in his quarters for hours, staring at the wall. 4 generations of Torres men had served their country. 3 of them were dead. The 4th was a 19-year-old Marine burning with anger he did not understand. And all of it connected to Elena, to her father, to Raymond himself. The threads of history had tangled into a knot that no one could easily unravel. But perhaps, Raymond thought, perhaps that knot was not meant to be unraveled. Perhaps it was meant to be understood. The knowledge changed everything. Raymond shared his findings with Elena the next evening, sitting together on the same bench overlooking the ocean. She listened in silence as he laid out the connections, the generations, the tragedy that linked their families. Marcus does not know, Elena finally said. If he knew who I was, his anger would be directed specifically at me. But when he looks at me, he does not see Elena Mercer. He sees a nobody. That could change. Information has a way of finding the light. What do you think I should do? I think you need to understand him first, Raymond said. Before you decide what to tell him, you need to see who he really is beneath the anger. Because right now, you are 2 broken people circling each other without knowing you share the same wound. And Captain Hayes? Elena asked. He is the one who drives the harassment. The Marines follow his lead. Dalton Hayes is a different kind of broken. His father died a hero in Fallujah. He has spent his entire life trying to be worthy of that sacrifice. The arrogance you see is armor. Beneath it is a terrified boy who believes he will never be enough. Elena turned to look at him. You see all of that? I have had 30 years of practice at seeing what people try to hide. Raymond smiled. And I see something in you that you do not yet see in yourself. What is that? The capacity to help them both. Hayes and Torres. They are not your enemies, Elena. They are casualties of the same war that wounded you. Different battles, different years, but the same war. The war that takes fathers from sons and meaning from sacrifice. Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than Raymond had heard it since their first meeting. You are asking me to stop hiding. I'm asking you to start healing, and not just yourself. Healing has a way of spreading once it begins. The quarterly close quarters combat evaluation was scheduled for the following week. Elena did not know what awaited her there. Did not know that the confrontation building between her and Captain Hayes would expose everything she had tried so hard to hide. But she knew she was ready to stop running, and Raymond knew he would be there when she needed him. The dawn was coming. The morning sun rose over Camp Pendleton like a judgment. 600 Marines gathered on the main training field for the quarterly close quarters combat evaluation. They stood in formation, rows of young men and women in physical training gear, their bodies already glistening with sweat in the early heat. The air smelled of dust and anticipation and the particular tension that precedes violence. At the center of the field, a large blue wrestling mat had been laid out, 20 feet square. The arena where reputations would be made or destroyed. The stage where Captain Dalton Hayes had demonstrated his dominance for 3 consecutive years. Elena Mercer stood at the edge of the crowd near the medical tent that had been erected for the event. Her gray physical training gear was faded and unremarkable. Her posture was that of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. To the Marines who glanced in her direction, she was invisible. Just another support staff member. Nobody worth noticing. Raymond Colton had positioned himself near the front of the gathered crowd. His civilian clothes marked him as an observer rather than a participant, but his bearing still commanded a certain respect from the younger Marines who sensed the steel beneath his weathered exterior. His eyes moved constantly, tracking Elena, tracking Hayes, tracking the currents of tension that flowed through the assembled troops. Something was going to happen today. Raymond could feel it in his bones, the same instinct that had kept him alive in the jungles of his decades of special operations was screaming warnings that he could not quite articulate. Captain Dalton Hayes emerged from the command tent and walked toward the mat with the swagger of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He wore a sleeveless physical training shirt that displayed his massive arms, muscles carved from years of obsessive dedication. His jaw was set. His eyes were hard. He looked like a weapon searching for a target. The Marines parted before him like water before a ship's prow. Respect and fear mingled in their expressions. This was their commanding officer, their standard of excellence, the man they were supposed to become. Hayes stepped onto the blue mat and raised his arms, commanding silence without speaking a word. The crowd fell quiet, 600 pairs of eyes fixed on him. "Today we separate the warriors from the pretenders," Hayes announced. His voice carried across the field like artillery fire. "Today we find out who among you has what it takes to stand when everything is telling you to fall." He began pacing the edge of the mat, his movements predatory. "I have heard whispers in the barracks, complaints about the training being too hard, too demanding, too brutal." He stopped and scanned the crowd with contempt. "Let me be clear about something. Combat is brutal. The enemy does not care about your feelings. The enemy does not care about your comfort. The enemy only cares about putting you in the ground." Raymond watched Hayes with the detached analysis of a man who had seen too many officers like him. The speech was standard motivational fare designed to intimidate and inspire in equal measure. But there was something different about Hayes today, an edge that went beyond normal aggression, a desperation that leaked through the cracks in his armor. "We train hard because hard training saves lives," Hayes continued. "We push ourselves beyond our limits because limits are what get Marines killed. And we do not make excuses for weakness. We eliminate it." His eyes swept across the crowd and stopped on the medical tent, on Elena. Raymond's instincts went from warning to alarm. "Speaking of weakness," Hayes said, and something ugly crept into his voice, "I notice we have our medical support present today, ready to patch up anyone who cannot handle the pressure." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. Most Marines recognized the shift in Hayes' tone. This was no longer a general speech. This was becoming personal. Hayes walked toward the edge of the mat closest to Elena, his gaze fixed on her with predatory intensity. "Tell me something, medical contractor. Do you enjoy watching real warriors train? Does it make you feel important, standing on the sidelines with your bandages and your antiseptic?" Elena did not respond. She kept her eyes forward, her expression neutral, her body language carefully controlled. She had endured worse than this. She had faced interrogators who made Hayes look like a child throwing a tantrum. But Raymond saw what others could not. He saw the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in her stance. Hayes had touched something that went deeper than professional insult. "I wonder sometimes about the support staff who end up on military bases," Hayes continued, warming to his cruelty. "What brings them here? Could not make it in the real world? Looking for a safe place to hide while real men and women do the dangerous work?" The laughter had stopped. The Marines in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Even those who had mocked Elena in the past recognized that Hayes was crossing a line. There was something desperate in his attack, something that had nothing to do with Elena herself. "Or maybe," Hayes said, and his voice dropped to something almost like a whisper that still carried across the silent field. "Maybe they are running from something. Maybe they made mistakes that got people killed, and now they hide behind medical carts and supply cabinets, hoping no one will remember what they did." Elena's face went white. Raymond felt his heart stop. Hayes could not know. It was impossible. Elena's records were classified at levels that a Marine captain could never access. Her history with JSOC, her role in the Syria operation, the deaths that haunted her, all of it was buried beneath layers of security that should have been impenetrable. But somehow Hayes had found words that cut directly to the wound she carried. "I have seen it before," Hayes continued. "People who make decisions that cost lives. People whose confidence outpaced their competence. And instead of facing the consequences, they run. They hide. They pretend to be something small and insignificant, hoping the ghost will not find them." The silence on the training field had become absolute. 600 Marines stood frozen, sensing that something profound was happening, but not understanding what. Elena stood motionless. Her face had become a mask, but Raymond could see her hands trembling at her sides, trembling with grief, with guilt, with something else that was beginning to replace them. Anger. "The problem with ghosts," Hayes said, "is that they always find you, no matter how small you make yourself, No matter how invisible you become, the dead have long memories. He turned away from Elena, apparently satisfied with the damage he had inflicted. Now then, let us begin the evaluation. Who wants to be first to test themselves against the standard? Raymond pushed through the crowd toward Elena. He needed to get her away from here before Hayes could do more damage, before the situation escalated into something that could not be controlled. But he was not fast enough. I will. Elena's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Everyone turned. Hayes turned. Raymond stopped mid-stride, his blood running cold. Elena stepped forward from the medical tent. Her posture had changed. The invisible woman who had spent 18 months trying to disappear was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. Someone whose eyes held the stillness of deep water. Someone whose presence suddenly commanded attention despite her small frame. I will test myself against the standard, Captain Hayes. The silence that followed Elena's words was so complete that Raymond could hear his own heartbeat. Hayes stared at her as if she had spontaneously combusted. His expression moved through several phases in rapid succession. Surprise, amusement, contempt, and beneath all of that, something that looked almost like fear. You, Hayes said, the medical contractor wants to participate in combat evaluation? I believe I made myself clear, Captain. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marines exchanged glances of disbelief and anticipation. This was unprecedented. Support staff did not challenge combat officers. It simply was not done. Hayes recovered his composure with visible effort. His lips curled into a smile that did not reach his eyes. You have no idea what you are asking for, little nurse. This is not a first aid demonstration. This is real combat training. People get hurt. I am aware of the nature of the evaluation, Captain. Hayes took a step toward her, then another. He used his size deliberately, looming over her like a storm cloud over a single flower. Let me explain something to you. I have spent 20 years training for combat. I have fought in 3 wars. I have killed men with my bare hands. And you think you can step onto my mat and challenge me? Elena did not flinch, did not step back, did not show any sign of intimidation. I am not challenging you to a fight, Captain Hayes. I am challenging you to a test. What test? 3 minutes, Elena's voice carried across the field with surprising clarity. If you can touch me once in 3 minutes, I will leave this base today. I will resign my position and you will never see me again. Hayes laughed, a harsh sound devoid of genuine humor. And if you cannot touch me in 3 minutes, you will spend 1 week volunteering at the Veterans Hospital with Master Sergeant Colton. You will meet the men and women who have paid the price that you demand from your trainees. You will learn what sacrifice actually looks like. Raymond closed his eyes. She was invoking his name, bringing him into this confrontation whether he wanted to be there or not. But he understood why. She was not just challenging Hayes. She was offering him a chance at redemption, a path toward understanding something his aggression had always hidden from. Hayes' smile faded, his eyes narrowed. You think this is a joke? I think you have spent your entire career measuring strength by how much damage you can inflict, Elena replied. I think there are other kinds of strength, kinds you have never learned to recognize, kinds that do not require destruction. The crowd was utterly silent. Marines who had spent years following Hayes' example of dominance and intimidation were watching a small woman speak to their commander with absolute calm. 3 minutes, Hayes repeated. You believe you can evade me for 3 minutes. I believe that you are incapable of touching me for 3 minutes. There is a difference. Something snapped in Hayes' expression. The mask of professional contempt cracked, revealing the wounded boy beneath. The boy who had spent his entire life trying to be worthy of a dead father's sacrifice. The boy who measured his worth by his ability to dominate others. This small woman was not just challenging his physical skills. She was challenging the entire foundation of his identity. Fine, Hayes said, his voice had gone cold. Get on the mat. Elena walked toward the blue square with steps that seemed to carry no weight. She moved like water, like smoke, like something that existed between moments rather than within them. Raymond pushed forward until he was at the edge of the crowd. He caught Elena's eye as she stepped onto the mat. She gave him the slightest nod, a gesture of reassurance, or perhaps a gesture of farewell. Then she turned to face Captain Dalton Hayes. The 600 Marines arranged themselves around the mat. Word had spread through the ranks with the speed of wildfire. Training exercises had been abandoned. Duty stations had been briefly deserted. Everyone wanted to see what was about to happen. A lieutenant stepped forward to serve as timekeeper. He held up a stopwatch with hands that trembled slightly. 3 minutes, he announced. Standard evaluation rules. Captain Hayes will attempt to make contact with the challenger. If contact is made, the challenge ends. If 3 minutes pass without contact, the challenger wins. Hayes removed his training shirt, revealing a torso that looked like it had been sculpted from bronze. Muscles rippled beneath his skin as he rolled his shoulders, loosening up. He bounced on the balls of his feet, generating the kinetic energy that he would unleash on this woman who dared to challenge him. Elena stood motionless. She did not stretch, did not warm up, did not move at all. She simply stood in the center of the mat with her arms relaxed at her sides, watching Hayes with those gray eyes that held the stillness of mountains. Begin, the lieutenant said. Hayes exploded forward. The first attack was a straight punch, launched with devastating speed. 220 pounds of trained muscle behind a fist that had broken jaws and shattered ribs. It hit nothing. Elena was simply not there. She had moved, but the movement was so small, so precise, that it barely registered to the watching eyes. A slight rotation of her shoulders, a minimal tilt of her head. The punch screamed past her face by perhaps 2 inches. Hayes' momentum carried him forward. He spun, throwing a backhand strike that would have connected with any normal opponent. Again, nothing. Elena had shifted her weight, dropped her center of gravity by perhaps an inch, and the backhand passed over her head like a bird flying over still water. A gasp went through the crowd. Raymond felt his throat tighten. He recognized what he was seeing, recognized the technique, recognized where she had learned it. SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, escape. The program designed to teach special operations personnel how to survive capture and interrogation. Part of that training involved learning to evade physical attacks without escalating conflict, how to absorb aggression, how to become untouchable. But Elena was not just using SEER techniques. She had refined them, perfected them, transformed them into something that looked less like military training and more like a form of meditation in motion. Hayes attacked again. A combination this time. Jab, cross, hook, uppercut. Each strike thrown with professional precision, the product of 20 years of combat training. Each strike found only empty air. Elena moved like she was dancing with the wind. Her feet barely left the ground. Her body flowed around the attacks as if she could see them coming before Hayes even knew he was going to throw them. Raymond understood what she was doing. She was reading his body language, anticipating his movements based on the tension in his muscles, the shifting of his weight, the subtle telegraphs that every fighter sends before every attack. It was a skill that took decades to develop, a skill that came from fighting not with aggression, but with awareness, a skill that turned the opponent's strength into their weakness. Hayes was growing frustrated. His attacks became wilder, less controlled. He stopped using technique and started using rage, throwing punches and kicks with increasingly desperate abandon. None of them connected. 1 minute passed, then 90 seconds. Sweat poured down Hayes' face. His breathing had become ragged. He was burning through his energy reserves at an unsustainable rate, exhausting himself against an opponent who seemed to expend no energy at all. The crowd had gone absolutely silent. 600 Marines watched something they had never seen before. A small woman making their strongest officer look helpless. Not by fighting back, not by matching his aggression, but by simply refusing to be where his attacks landed. Raymond found himself holding his breath. The ghost of Harold Mercer seemed to stand beside him, watching his daughter demonstrate a strength that went beyond muscle and violence. 2 minutes. Hayes stopped attacking. He stood in the center of the mat, chest heaving, arms hanging at his sides. His face was crimson with exertion and humiliation. His eyes were wild with something that looked like panic. "Stand still," he gasped. "Fight me. Face me like a soldier." Elena remained motionless a few feet away. She was not even breathing hard. Her gray physical training shirt showed no signs of sweat. She looked like she could continue for hours. "I am not here to fight you, Captain Hayes. I am here to show you something." "Show me what?" "That strength is not the ability to cause damage. Strength is the ability to choose not to. You have spent your entire life trying to prove your worth through domination. But the strongest warriors are the ones who do not need to prove anything at all." Hayes roared and launched himself at her with renewed fury. His attacks were formless now, driven by pure desperation. He threw himself at her again and again, each assault more frantic than the last. Elena evaded everything. She moved like water parting around a stone, like shadow fleeing from light, like something that existed in a different dimension, subject to different rules. 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Hayes stumbled. His legs were giving out. 20 years of combat training, thousands of hours in the gym, and he was being defeated by a woman who refused to throw a single punch. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Hayes fell to his knees. His lungs burned. His muscles screamed. He looked up at Elena with an expression that held no more anger, only confusion, only loss. "How?" he gasped. "How are you doing this?" Elena knelt down so her face was level with his. When she spoke, her voice was soft enough that only he could hear. And Raymond, who had moved close enough to the edge of the mat to catch her words. "Your father died a hero, Captain Hayes. He gave everything so that others could live. And you have spent your entire life believing that the only way to honor that sacrifice was to become what he was. Strong, dominant, unbeatable." Hayes's eyes went wide. How did she know about his father? How could this stranger see straight through to the wound he had carried for 30 years? "But that is not what your father wanted for you," Elena continued. "He did not die so you could spend your life hurting others to prove your own worth. He died so you could live, really live, with compassion, with wisdom, with the strength to be gentle when gentleness is what is needed." 3 minutes. The lieutenant's voice cut through the silence. "Time, the challenge is complete." Elena stood up. She extended her hand to Hayes, an offer of assistance, an offer of something more. "Your father would be proud of you, Captain Hayes, not for your muscles, not for your medals, but for the moment you choose to become something more than what you have been." Hayes stared at her hand. The moment stretched into eternity. And then slowly he reached up and took it. Raymond Colton had seen many things in his 70 years. He had witnessed acts of courage that defied description. He had watched men die with honor and others die screaming for mercy. He had experienced the full spectrum of human behavior, from the most depraved to the most noble. But he had never seen anything quite like what he had just witnessed. Elena helped Hayes to his feet. The massive Marine stood before the small woman, his face a mask of confusion and something that looked almost like relief, as if a weight he had been carrying for decades had suddenly been lifted. The crowd remained frozen in stunned silence. 600 Marines trying to process what they had seen. Their unbeatable commanding officer brought to his knees by a medical contractor who never threw a single punch. Raymond pushed through the crowd toward Elena. He needed to reach her, needed to understand what had just happened, needed to make sure she was all right. But before he could reach the mat, the sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the morning air. Everyone turned. A black government SUV was speeding across the training field, throwing up clouds of dust in its wake. It came to a stop near the edge of the gathered crowd, and 3 figures emerged. Raymond recognized the woman in the lead immediately. The way she moved, the way she commanded space without speaking. The particular authority that came from years of operating in the shadows. Colonel Victoria Shaw, JSOC. Raymond had encountered her once, years ago, during a classified briefing that he was not supposed to remember. Shaw walked directly toward Elena, ignoring the hundreds of Marines who parted before her like grass before wind. Her face was grave. Her eyes held something that looked like urgency mixed with grief. "Lieutenant Commander Mercer," Shaw said. The rank landed like a bone in the silent crowd. Marines who had dismissed Elena as a nobody suddenly realized they were standing in the presence of a naval officer who outranked most of them. Elena turned to face her former commanding officer. Her expression shifted from the calm she had maintained during the confrontation with Hayes to something harder, more guarded. "Colonel Shaw, I left JSOC 18 months ago. I am no longer under your command." "I know." Shaw's voice carried the weight of whatever news she had brought. "But I am not here as your commanding officer. I am here as someone who needs your help." "My help?" Shaw glanced at the crowd around them, at the Marines still processing the events of the past few minutes, at Hayes, who stood nearby looking lost. "We should discuss this privately. Whatever you have to say, Colonel, you can say it here. I am done with secrets." Shaw studied Elena's face for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly, apparently accepting that this conversation would happen on Elena's terms. "It is about Daniel Vance." The name hit Elena like a physical blow. Raymond saw her stagger slightly, saw her face go pale beneath the California sun. "Danny is dead," Elena said. Her voice had become thin, brittle. "He died in Syria 18 months ago. I watched the footage." "You watched the footage of the ambush," Shaw corrected. "You saw him go down. But the body was never recovered. The extraction team, The extraction team reported him KIA based on what they witnessed. But 3 days ago, we received intelligence that suggests otherwise. Raymond watched Elena's face cycle through emotions too complex and rapid to categorize. Hope, fear, disbelief. Grief renewed by the possibility that grief had been premature. What intelligence? Elena whispered. Shaw reached into her jacket and produced a tablet computer. She handed it to Elena. This footage was captured from an enemy propaganda video released 2 days ago. Watch the man in the background at the 14-second mark. Elena's hands trembled as she took the tablet. She pressed play and watched. Raymond moved close enough to see over her shoulder. The video was grainy, shot in some kind of underground facility. Armed men spoke to the camera in a language Raymond did not recognize. They were making threats, demands, the usual rhetoric of those who had chosen violence as their vocabulary. But at the 14-second mark, a figure was visible in the background. A man in dirty clothes, hands bound, face obscured by shadow and beard. He was looking directly at the camera with eyes that held no fear, only calculation. And his right hand, barely visible in the frame, was making a gesture, a specific pattern of finger movements that meant nothing to anyone who did not know what to look for. Elena's breath caught. She watched the gesture repeat twice before the camera angle changed. "That is Danny's sign," she said. Her voice was barely audible. "The pattern we developed for covert communication. No one else knows that pattern. No one else could make those movements." "Senior Chief Daniel Vance is alive," Shaw confirmed. "He has been held captive for 18 months in a location we have only recently identified. And he is using the communication protocols you developed together to send us information." Elena looked up from the tablet. Her gray eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Why are you telling me this?" "I left JSOC. I am not operational. I cannot lead a rescue." "We are not asking you to lead a rescue," Shaw said. "The tactical elements are already in motion. But Vance is not just transmitting his location. He is transmitting intelligence, complex data about the network that has been holding him. Information that could help us dismantle an entire terrorist infrastructure." Shaw paused, her expression growing even more serious. "The problem is that the transmissions are encrypted. He is using codes that only you would understand, analytical frameworks that you developed together during your years at JSOC. Our best cryptographers have been working on the data for 72 hours, and they cannot crack it." Understanding dawned on Elena's face. "You need me to decode his messages." "You are the only person who can. Vance designed it that way. He knew that if he was ever captured, the only person he would trust with critical intelligence was you." Raymond watched the emotions play across Elena's face. The woman who had spent 18 months hiding from her past was suddenly being asked to confront it directly. The guilt she carried over the Syria operation, the belief that she had gotten her team killed, was colliding with the reality that one of them had survived. "He is alive," Elena said again, as if she needed to hear the words to believe them. "Danny is alive. He is alive, and he needs you." The crowd of Marines had become irrelevant. The confrontation with Hayes had become irrelevant. The entire world had narrowed to this moment, this revelation, this impossible second chance. Elena looked at Raymond, the old man who had walked into her life 3 weeks ago and begun the process of putting her back together. "I have to go," she said. "I know. I might not come back." "You will come back. You are Harold Mercer's daughter. You do not leave missions incomplete." Elena turned back to Shaw. "Where do you need me?" "There is a helicopter waiting. We will brief you en route." Elena nodded. She began walking toward the black SUV, toward the life she had tried so hard to escape. But she stopped after a few steps and turned back to face Hayes, who still stood on the mat, looking like a man whose entire worldview had been demolished. "Captain Hayes, I expect to see you at the Veterans Hospital when I return. You made a promise." Hayes stared at her. Then slowly he straightened his posture. Some of the old arrogance returned to his bearing, but it was tempered now by something else. Something that looked almost like respect. "I keep my promises, Commander." Elena nodded. Then she looked at Raymond one last time. "Take care of them for me. Hayes, Torres, the broken ones. They need someone who can see what they are hiding." "I will be here when you get back," Raymond promised. "I have been waiting 30 years to repay my debt to your father. I am not going anywhere." Elena smiled, a real smile, perhaps the first Raymond had seen from her since they met. Then she turned and walked toward the helicopter that would carry her back into the world of shadows and sacrifice. Raymond watched her go until the aircraft lifted off and disappeared into the California sky. Then he turned to face Captain Hayes and the 600 Marines who were still trying to understand what they had witnessed. The work of healing had only begun. The helicopter's rotors faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything Raymond had experienced since the jungles of Laos. He stood at the edge of the training field, an old man surrounded by young warriors, carrying knowledge that none of them possessed. He knew about Elena's true identity. He knew about the Torres family connections that spanned 4 generations. He knew about the debts of sacrifice that linked all of them together in ways they did not understand. And now he knew that Danny Vance was alive. The man Elena believed she had killed with her faulty intelligence was not dead. He was captured, suffering, but alive. The implications of that revelation were staggering. If Vance was alive, then Elena's guilt had been built on a foundation that was not quite what she believed. Yes, 2 men had died in the Syria ambush. Michael Torres and Kevin Williams would never come home. But the third death, the one that had broken Elena's heart because Vance had been more than a colleague, was not a death at all. It was an imprisonment, a captivity that had lasted 18 months while Elena tortured herself with grief and guilt. Raymond wondered what that knowledge would do to her. Would it heal her, knowing that the man she loved had survived? Or would it wound her further, knowing that he had been suffering in enemy hands while she hid in a medical building, feeling sorry for herself? Either way, she would have to face it, and Raymond would be here when she returned, ready to help her process whatever she discovered. But first, he had work to do at Camp Pendleton. He turned to survey the scene around him. The Marines were dispersing slowly, returning to their duties with the dazed expressions of people who had witnessed something they could not explain. The quarterly evaluation had been effectively canceled. No one seemed to know what to do next. Captain Hayes still stood on the blue mat, alone now, staring at the spot where Elena had stood during their confrontation. His massive frame seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the revelation that strength could take forms he had never imagined. Raymond walked toward him. His old legs protested the movement, but he ignored them. Some conversations were too important to delay. Captain Hayes? Hayes looked up. His eyes were red, though whether from exertion or emotion, Raymond could not tell. "Who are you?" Hayes asked. "She mentioned your name, said you would take me to the Veterans Hospital." "My name is Raymond Colton. I served in classified operations with JSOC Special Operations, and I have spent the past 30 years learning the lessons that woman was trying to teach you." "What lessons?" Raymond gestured toward a bench at the edge of the field. "Walk with me. We have time." They walked together in silence, the massive Marine and the elderly veteran, until they reached the bench overlooking the ocean. The same bench where Raymond had sat with Elena so many times over the past weeks. "Sit," Raymond said. Hayes sat. Raymond lowered himself onto the bench with a grunt. His bones were not made for this kind of activity anymore, but some things were worth the pain. "That woman," Raymond said, "is named Elena Mercer. She is the daughter of Colonel Harold Mercer, who received the Medal of Honor posthumously for actions in Laos in 1971. Hayes's expression shifted. The Medal of Honor was sacred ground for any military family. His own father's Navy Cross was the second highest valor award possible. But the Medal of Honor was something else entirely. "I did not know," Hayes said. "No one did. She came here to hide from a past that was eating her alive, a past that included an operation that went wrong and cost men their lives. The things I said to her," Hayes's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. "You said things that struck closer to the truth than you could have known. That was not your fault, but now you understand why she reacted the way she did, why she challenged you, why she needed to prove something, not to you but to herself." Hayes was quiet for a long moment. The waves crashed against the rocks below. Seabirds called in the distance. "My father died in Fallujah," Hayes finally said. "I was 7 years old. I have spent my entire life trying to be worthy of his sacrifice." "I know." "How do you know?" "Because I have spent 30 years trying to be worthy of the same thing. Colonel Mercer, Elena's father, died saving my life. He walked into an enemy ambush alone so that I could escape. And every day since then, I have asked myself the same question you ask yourself. Am I living a life that justifies his death?" Hayes turned to look at Raymond. For the first time, the aggression was completely gone from his face. In its place was something vulnerable, something young. "Does it ever stop?" Hayes asked. "The feeling that you will never be enough?" "No," Raymond admitted. "It never stops completely. But it can change. It can become something other than guilt. It can become motivation, purpose, a reason to live better than you would have otherwise." "How?" Raymond smiled, the same sad smile he had offered Elena when she asked the same question. "By understanding what sacrifice actually means. Your father did not die so you could become the strongest man on base. He did not die so you could intimidate recruits and prove your dominance. He died so you could live, really live, with compassion, with wisdom, with the strength to be gentle when gentleness is what is needed. Hayes closed his eyes. The words were landing somewhere deep inside him, in places that had been locked away for 30 years. That is what Elena said to me, on the mat. She said my father would be proud of me, not for my muscles or my medals, but for the moment I choose to become something more. She is Harold Mercer's daughter. She inherited his ability to see through people, to find the truth they are hiding, even from themselves. They sat in silence for a while. The sun climbed higher, the heat intensified, but neither of them moved. What happens now? Hayes finally asked. Now you keep your promise. You spend a week at the Veterans Hospital. You meet the men and women who paid prices that cannot be measured in medals and commendations. You learn what sacrifice looks like when the cameras are gone and the parades are over. And then? And then you decide what kind of officer you want to be. The kind who breaks people down, or the kind who builds them up. The kind who proves his worth through domination, or the kind who earns respect through service. Hayes nodded slowly. The decision was not made yet. Raymond could see that. The habits of a lifetime could not be changed in a single morning, but the seed had been planted. And sometimes a seed was enough. Raymond pushed himself to his feet with effort. I have another conversation to have, another broken person to reach. Torres, Hayes said, Private Torres, I have been hard on him. You have seen yourself in him, the anger, the need to prove something, the weight of a dead father. Is that why he is the way he is? His father died too, Staff Sergeant Antonio Torres. He killed himself 3 years ago. Hayes's face went pale. I did not know. You did not ask, and that is another lesson, Captain. Sometimes the most important intelligence is the kind that lives inside the people around you. The kind you can only access through compassion rather than interrogation. Raymond walked away, leaving Hayes alone on the bench with his thoughts. There was one more conversation to have before this day was done. One more broken person to reach. He had promised Elena he would take care of them. And Raymond Colton kept his promises. Raymond found Marcus Torres in the barracks, sitting on his bunk, staring at nothing. The young Marine's face was expressionless, but Raymond could see the turmoil beneath the surface. The confrontation on the training field had shaken something loose in him. Watching the woman he had mocked defeat his commanding officer without throwing a punch had challenged everything he thought he understood about strength. Private Torres. Marcus looked up. His dark eyes were guarded, suspicious. Who are you? My name is Raymond Colton. I knew your great-grandfather. The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. His expression shifted from suspicion to confusion to something that looked almost like pain. My great-grandfather? Miguel Torres. We served together in classified operations. He was one of the finest soldiers I ever knew. Marcus stared at Raymond as if he were seeing a ghost. In a way, he was. Raymond was a living connection to a past that Marcus had only known through stories and photographs. May I sit? Raymond asked. Marcus nodded slowly. Raymond lowered himself onto the bunk opposite the young man. The barracks were empty. Everyone else was still out on the training field, processing the morning's events. Your great-grandfather saved my life once, Raymond said. We were ambushed near the Cambodian border. I took a round in the leg and could not walk. Miguel carried me for 3 miles through enemy territory, refused to leave me behind. Marcus's jaw tightened. He never talked about the war. My grandfather told me he came back different. We all came back different. The war changed everyone who fought in it, but Miguel came back alive, which was more than many could say. He came back and built a family, your family. And then my father went to war, Marcus said. His voice had become bitter. And my cousin went to war. And now I am going to war. 4 generations of Torres men giving everything to this country. And what did this country give us? Raymond heard the anger beneath the words, the grief that had been transmuted into rage, the loss that demanded someone to blame. Your father was a hero, Raymond said softly. I did not know him personally, but I know his story. He served with distinction. He earned medals that most soldiers only dream of. And then he killed himself, Marcus snapped. Put a gun in his mouth in our garage while my mother was at work and I was at school. Some hero. Raymond did not flinch from the anger. He had heard this rage before, in his own voice, in the voices of countless veterans who had struggled to make sense of what they had survived. Your father was wounded, Raymond said, not in his body, but in his soul. The war did that to him. The things he saw, the things he had to do, they left scars that no one could see. And eventually those scars became too heavy to carry. He should have been stronger. Strength has limits, Marcus. Even the strongest men have breaking points. Your father reached his. That does not make him weak. It makes him human. Marcus's hands were clenched into fists. The anger was still there. But beneath it, Raymond could see the grief trying to break through. The tears that had never been shed. The pain that had never been acknowledged. I hate him, Marcus said. The words came out broken, fractured. I hate him for leaving us, for leaving me. I know. I joined the Marines because I wanted to understand. I wanted to know why he could face bullets and bombs overseas, but could not face breakfast with his family. I wanted to find whatever he found in war, the thing that made sense to him when nothing else did. And have you found it? Marcus looked away. His jaw worked silently for a moment. I found the anger, the same anger he had. The rage that makes you feel alive because feeling anything else hurts too much. Raymond nodded slowly. He understood this boy, understood him in ways that no one else on this base possibly could. Because Raymond had been this boy 30 years ago, angry at the world, angry at the war, angry at the friend who had died saving his life. Let me tell you something about anger, Raymond said. It can be fuel, like your father told you. But it can also be poison. It depends on what you do with it. What did you do with yours? I nearly destroyed everything. My marriage, my family, my own life. I sat in my garage with a pistol in my hands, ready to follow my friend into the dark. Marcus looked up sharply. The admission had gotten his attention. What stopped you? My wife. She reminded me that dying would not honor the sacrifice of the man who had given his life for mine. She reminded me that the best way to repay a debt of blood is with a life well lived. Raymond leaned forward, his voice dropping. Your father's death was a tragedy, Marcus. It was a failure of the system that should have supported him. It was the final wound inflicted by a war that he never truly escaped. But it does not have to define you. His sacrifice, and it was a sacrifice, even if it did not look like one, that sacrifice gave you a choice. You can let the anger consume you, like it consumed him, or you can transform it into something else. Into what? Into service, into compassion, into the strength to help others who are carrying the same weight you carry. Marcus was crying now, tears streaming down his face for the first time since his father's funeral. The grief that had been locked away behind walls of anger was finally breaking free. Raymond moved to sit beside him on the bunk. He put an arm around the young man's shoulders, the way he wished someone had done for him 30 years ago. Your great-grandfather was a hero, Raymond said. Your father was a hero. Your cousin Michael was a hero, and you have the same blood in your veins, the same capacity for courage and sacrifice. But heroism is not just about fighting battles. It is about choosing to keep living when every part of you wants to stop. It is about building something meaningful from the wreckage of loss. Marcus sobbed against his shoulder. The sound of a boy finally mourning the father he had lost. The sound of grief being released instead of transmuted into rage. Raymond held him through it, patient, steady, present. This was what he had promised Elena. This was how he would repay his debt to Harold Mercer. One broken person at a time. One moment of compassion at a time. One step out of the darkness at a time. The sun set over Camp Pendleton, the barracks filled with the sounds of returning Marines. But in that corner, an old man and a young soldier sat together in the fading light, beginning the long work of healing. Elena had shown them all something important today. She had demonstrated that strength was not about domination. It was about choice, about compassion, about the courage to be vulnerable. Now it was time to put that lesson into practice. And somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, a helicopter carried Elena toward the next chapter of her story, toward Danny Vance, toward the truth about the operation that had broken her, toward redemption. The helicopter cut through the California sky like a blade through silk. Elena sat in the rear compartment, her eyes fixed on the horizon but seeing nothing. The world outside the window was a blur of blue and gold, the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly beneath them. Inside, the rotors beat a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, fast, urgent, afraid. Danny was alive. The words kept repeating in her mind, each repetition bringing a new wave of emotion. Joy, terror, guilt, hope. She had spent 18 months believing she had killed him, had carried his death like a stone around her neck, letting it drag her down into the darkness of self-punishment. And now she learned that while she had been hiding in a medical building, feeling sorry for herself, he had been suffering in enemy hands. Alone, forgotten, waiting for rescue that never came. Colonel Victoria Shaw sat across from her, a tablet computer in her hands, reviewing data that Elena could not see. Shaw had aged in the 18 months since Elena left JSOC. New lines around her eyes, new gray in her close-cropped hair. The weight of command had taken its toll, as it always did. "We will be at the operations center in 40 minutes, Shaw said without looking up. "I need you ready to work the moment we land." "I understand." "Do you?" Shaw finally raised her eyes to meet Elena's. "Because the woman I knew 18 months ago would have been asking questions from the moment we took off. You have not said a word since we left Camp Pendleton." Elena turned away from the window. "What questions should I be asking?" "How about the obvious ones? How did Vance survive the ambush? Where has he been held? Who has him? What intelligence is he transmitting? Why can our cryptographers not decode it?" "I assume you will brief me on all of that when we arrive." Shaw set down the tablet and leaned forward. Her expression shifted from professional detachment to something more personal. "Elena, I need to know something before we go any further. Are you capable of doing this?" "Doing what exactly?" "Working intelligence again. Making decisions that could determine whether Danny lives or dies. Functioning at the level I need you to function at." Elena felt the weight of the question. It was not an insult, it was a genuine concern. Shaw had seen what Elena was like when she left JSOC. Broken, doubting, unable to trust her own judgment. "I spent 18 months believing I killed him," Elena said slowly. "I punished myself every day for a death that apparently never happened. And while I was wallowing in my guilt, he was being tortured by people who want to destroy everything we stand for." She met Shaw's eyes with a steadiness that surprised them both. "Yes, Colonel, I am capable of doing this. Because I owe him 18 months of suffering that I cannot take back. The least I can do is help bring him home." Shaw studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once, a gesture of acceptance. "Good, because we are out of options. Every analyst we have has tried to decode his transmissions. They all failed. You are literally the only person in the world who can read what he is sending us." "Tell me about the transmissions." Shaw handed her the tablet. On the screen was a series of images captured from enemy propaganda videos. In each one, Danny Vance was visible in the background. Dirty, bearded, thin, but alive. And in each image, his hands were making subtle gestures. Finger movements that looked random to anyone who did not know what to look for. "He started transmitting 3 weeks ago," Shaw explained. "We did not notice at first. The gestures are so subtle that our video analysts almost missed them. But once we identified the pattern, we realized he was sending structured data, coordinates, names, network connections. The intelligence framework we developed together," Elena said. She was already studying the gestures, her mind automatically translating them into the code language she and Danny had created years ago. "We designed it to be unbreakable by anyone outside our team, which is why our cryptographers cannot crack it. They do not have the key, only you do." Elena scrolled through the images. Each one contained a fragment of information, a piece of a puzzle that Danny had been assembling for 18 months in captivity. He had been gathering intelligence the entire time, waiting, preparing, trusting that eventually someone would notice. Trusting that she would notice. "He knew," Elena whispered. "He knew I would come for him. He never doubted it, not for a moment." Elena looked up from the tablet. "How do you know that?" Shaw reached into her jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. She handed it to Elena with something like reverence. "This was recovered from a raid 6 months ago. We did not understand its significance until now." Elena unfolded the paper. It was dirty and torn, clearly having been hidden and handled many times. The handwriting was Danny's, cramped and careful, written in a code that she recognized instantly. The message was short, just 3 sentences. "If you are reading this, I am still alive. Tell Elena I never blamed her. Tell her I am waiting." Elena's hands trembled as she held the paper. Tears she had been fighting since leaving Camp Pendleton finally broke free. "He never blamed me," she said. Her voice cracked on the words. "All this time I thought I killed him, and he never blamed me. He knew the intelligence was compromised. He knew it was not your fault. He has spent 18 months holding on to that truth while his captors tried to break him." Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The grief that had consumed her for so long was transforming into something else. Something harder. Something with edges. "Purpose. Tell me everything," she said. Tell me where he is and who has him. Tell me what I need to do to bring him home." Shaw retrieved the tablet and pulled up a map of Syria. A red marker indicated a location in the eastern desert near the border with Iraq. He is being held in a compound operated by a splinter cell that broke off from the main terrorist network after the Syria operation went wrong. They blame the United States for the deaths of their leaders in that raid. Danny is their proof that they can hurt us. The raid that was supposed to kill the bomb maker. Yes, the same raid where we lost Torres and Williams. The same raid that destroyed your confidence and drove you into hiding. Elena stared at the red marker on the map. 18 months of suffering. Hers and Danny's. All because of one compromised intelligence source. One betrayal that had cost so much. The double agent, Elena said, the one who fed us the false intelligence. Was he ever identified? Shaw's expression darkened. He was executed by his own handlers 3 months after the operation. They blamed him for the failure of the ambush. Apparently our team killed too many of their people on the way out. They decided he must have been a triple agent working for us. So he is dead. Yes, but the damage he caused is still rippling outward. Danny is proof of that. Elena nodded slowly. Justice for the betrayal had already been served in a twisted sort of way. The double agent had been killed by the very people he tried to help. There was a dark irony in that. But justice did not bring back Michael Torres or Kevin Williams. It did not erase the 18 months Danny had spent in captivity. It did not heal the wounds that Elena carried. Only action could do that now. "What is the extraction plan?" Elena asked. "SEAL Team 6 has a unit standing by. The same unit that Danny served with before his capture. They have been preparing for this mission since we confirmed he was alive." "When do they go in?" "That depends on you. Danny's transmissions include coordinates for the compound, guard rotations, and entry points. But there is additional information that we cannot decode. Information that could be critical to the success of the mission." "What kind of information?" "We do not know. That is the problem. The last 3 transmissions are in a layer of the code that only you can access. Danny designed it that way, a fail-safe to ensure that only someone he trusted completely could read the most sensitive data." Elena understood. Danny had always been paranoid about security. It was what made him such an effective operator. He trusted no one completely except the people he had worked with personally. The people who had earned that trust through years of shared sacrifice. People like Elena. "I need to see the raw footage," Elena said, "all of it. Every video where he appears, every gesture he has made. It will be waiting for you when we land." The helicopter banked slightly, adjusting course toward the JSOC Operations Center. Elena watched the landscape change beneath them, green giving way to brown as they moved inland. Somewhere in that direction, thousands of miles away, Danny Vance was waiting, trusting that she would come, believing in her even when she had stopped believing in herself. She would not let him down again. The JSOC Operations Center was exactly as Elena remembered it. A vast room filled with screens and workstations, staffed by analysts and operators who moved with the quiet efficiency of people engaged in work that mattered. The air hummed with electronic energy and suppressed tension. Lives hung in the balance here. Decisions made in this room rippled outward across the globe. Elena had not set foot in this building for 18 months. She had thought she never would again. Yet here she was, walking through the security checkpoints like she had never left, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle onto her shoulders. Colonel Shaw led her to a private workstation in the corner of the room. Screens surrounded the desk, each one displaying different footage of Danny's captivity. Months of propaganda videos, captured and cataloged, waiting for someone who could read the messages hidden within them. "You have full access to everything we have," Shaw said. "I will be in the command center if you need me. The SEAL team is on standby, ready to launch the moment you give us actionable intelligence." "Understood." Shaw hesitated at the door. "Elena, I know I have no right to ask this, but welcome back." Elena did not turn around. Her eyes were already fixed on the screens, her mind already diving into the familiar patterns of analysis. "I am not back, Colonel. I am here to bring Danny home. After that, we will see." Shaw nodded and left. Elena sat down at the workstation and began to work. The first layer of Danny's transmissions was relatively simple. Coordinates for the compound, guard schedules, entry points that the enemy did not know were vulnerable. This was the intelligence that JSOC had already decoded, the information that would guide the SEAL team on their approach. But beneath that layer was something else, a deeper code, a message hidden within the message. Elena watched the footage frame by frame. Danny's fingers moved in patterns that looked random to the untrained eye, but to Elena they were as clear as written language. Each gesture had meaning, each sequence built on the last. Hour after hour she worked. The operations center shifted around her as staff came and went, as briefings were held, as the machinery of war continued its eternal grinding. Elena noticed none of it. Her world had narrowed to the screens and the man whose face appeared on them. Danny looked different than she remembered. Thinner, older. His eyes held a depth that came only from sustained suffering, but his hands moved with precision and purpose. He was still thinking, still planning, still fighting in the only way available to him. By the 6th hour, Elena had decoded the second layer of transmissions. The information was staggering. Danny had not just been gathering intelligence about his own captivity, he had been mapping the entire terrorist network that held him. Names of leaders, locations of safe houses, supply routes, funding sources, communication protocols. 18 months of patient observation, all recorded in the subtle movements of his fingers. "Colonel Shaw," Elena called out. Her voice was hoarse from hours of silence. "You need to see this." Shaw appeared at her side within minutes. She looked at the decoded data and her face went pale. "My God," Shaw whispered. "He mapped the entire network. Everything. Every connection, every vulnerability. This is enough to dismantle their operation completely." How did he get access to this level of intelligence? He is Danny Vance. He talks to people. He observes. He remembers everything. They probably had no idea he was gathering information just by watching and listening. Shaw pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. The implications of what she was seeing were clearly overwhelming. This changes everything. The extraction is no longer just about saving one man. It is about preserving this intelligence. "There is more," Elena said. "A third layer. I have not finished decoding it yet. What does it contain?" "I do not know, but Danny encoded it with our most secure protocol. Whatever it is, he considered it more important than everything else." Shaw looked at her with an expression that mixed hope and fear. "How long do you need?" "A few more hours, maybe less. The SEAL team is scheduled to launch at midnight. That gives you 8 hours. I will have it decoded before then." Shaw stood up. "I will brief the team on what you have found so far. Keep working." Elena turned back to the screens. The third layer was different from the others, more complex, more personal. Danny had encoded it using references that only she would understand. Shared memories, inside jokes, the private language that develops between people who have worked closely together for years. As she decoded each fragment, Elena felt something shifting inside her. The guilt that had defined her for 18 months was dissolving. In its place was something else: understanding, forgiveness, connection to the man who had never stopped believing in her. By the 10th hour, she had the complete message. She read it 3 times before she fully understood what Danny was telling her. Then she stood up, her legs unsteady, and walked to the command center. Colonel Shaw looked up as she entered. "Did you decode it?" "Yes." "What does it say?" Elena took a deep breath. The information she carried would change everything. Not just for the mission, for all of them. "The compound is a trap," she said. "They know we are coming." The command center fell silent. A dozen officers and analysts stared at Elena with expressions ranging from disbelief to horror. Colonel Shaw's face had gone white. "Explain," Shaw said. Elena walked to the main display screen. She pulled up the decoded message and began translating it into plain language. Danny discovered 3 days ago that his captors are aware of the rescue attempt. Someone in their network intercepted communications about the SEAL team's preparations. They have moved additional forces into the compound. The original plan will walk our people directly into a kill zone. How is that possible? Our communications are encrypted at the highest levels. I do not know. Danny does not know either, but he is certain about the trap. He has seen the preparations firsthand. Shaw turned to her communications officer. "Get me a full security audit of every transmission related to this operation, now." The officer nodded and began working frantically at his console. Elena continued. "There is more. Danny has identified an alternative approach, a secondary entrance to the compound that his captors do not know about. He has been working for weeks to create this opportunity." "What opportunity?" "A distraction. Tonight at exactly 0300 local time, Danny will initiate an event that will draw most of the guards to the eastern side of the compound. If our team enters from the west at that exact moment, they can reach him before the enemy realizes what is happening." Shaw studied the display. Her military mind was already processing the implications, calculating risks and probabilities. What kind of event? He did not specify. But whatever it is, it will be visible and it will be loud. He says we will know it when we see it. That is not much to go on. No, but it is, Danny. He does not make promises he cannot keep. Shaw was quiet for a long moment. The weight of command pressed down on her visibly. She was being asked to authorize a mission based on incomplete intelligence, with the knowledge that the original plan had been compromised. Lives hung in the balance. A wrong decision could get people killed. If we proceed with the original plan, we walk into an ambush, Shaw said slowly. If we modify based on Danny's intelligence, we are trusting a man who has been in captivity for 18 months. A man who might have been broken, turned, used against us. Danny would die before he would betray us, Elena said. Her voice held absolute conviction. You are certain of that? I am certain. Shaw looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned to the communications officer. Status on that security audit? Still running, ma'am. Initial results show no obvious compromises, but a full analysis will take hours. We do not have hours. Shaw made her decision. Contact the SEAL team. New orders. Modified approach. Western entrance at 0300 local time. The command center erupted into controlled chaos as staff began implementing the new plan. Elena stepped back, watching the machinery of war adjust to the intelligence she had provided. But something was still bothering her. Colonel Shaw, there is one more thing. Shaw looked up from the tactical display. What? Danny's message included a personal note, something he wanted me to know before the mission launched. What did it say? Elena hesitated. The words were burned into her memory. She did not need to look at the decoded text to recall them perfectly. He said that if the rescue fails, if he does not make it out, I should not blame myself. He said that every day he survived in captivity was a day he chose to keep living, a day he fought for the chance to see me again. Shaw's expression softened. He loves you. Yes. And you love him? Elena did not answer. Some truths did not need to be spoken. There is one more thing, Elena said. Danny's message included a request, something he considers critical to the success of the mission. What request? He wants me there, at the operations center, monitoring the mission in real time. He says he has additional intelligence to transmit once the rescue begins. Intelligence that will require immediate analysis and response. Shaw frowned. You want to run tactical support for this mission? Danny wants me to. He designed it that way. The entire operation depends on our ability to communicate through the code we developed. If something goes wrong, if plans need to change on the fly, I am the only one who can receive and interpret his signals. The weight of the request hung in the air. Elena was asking to return to the role she had fled 18 months ago. The role that had broken her, the role that had cost lives. If I do this, Elena said, and something goes wrong, if people die because of decisions I make, then you will carry that weight, Shaw finished. The way all of us do, the way your father did, the way Danny has for 18 months. Elena thought of her father, Harold Mercer, walking into the jungle alone to save his men, making the impossible choice that defined his legacy. She thought of Raymond Colton, 53 years of carrying a debt he could never fully repay, finding redemption in small acts of compassion and connection. She thought of Danny, waiting in darkness, trusting her to come for him. I will do it, Elena said. Set me up at a tactical station. I will monitor Danny's transmissions throughout the mission. Shaw nodded. Welcome back, Commander Mercer. The words struck something deep inside Elena. For 18 months, she had rejected that identity, had hidden from it, had tried to become nobody. But she was not nobody. She was the daughter of Harold Mercer. She was a JSOC intelligence officer. She was the woman that Danny Vance had waited 18 months to see again. And tonight, she would prove that she was worthy of all of it. 0200 hours. Elena sat at the tactical station, surrounded by screens displaying satellite feeds, drone footage, and real-time communications from the SEAL team. The familiar weight of headphones pressed against her ears. Her fingers rested on a keyboard, ready to transmit instant analysis to the operators in the field. 8 men were about to risk their lives on her intelligence. 8 families might be destroyed if she was wrong. The thought should have paralyzed her. Once, it would have. But something had changed in the hours since she arrived at the operations center. The guilt that had crippled her was still present, but it was no longer dominant. It shared space with something else now. Determination, purpose, love. Viper team, this is Overwatch, radio check. The voice of Lieutenant Commander Victor Shaw, the team leader, crackled through the communication system. No relation to Colonel Shaw, just a coincidence of names in a profession where coincidences often carried strange weight. Overwatch, Viper team copies, all units green, ready to proceed. Copy Viper, holding position for green light. Elena watched the satellite feed. The SEAL team was hidden in the desert, 3 miles from the compound. 8 figures in the darkness, waiting for the signal that would send them into hell. 0215. The compound appeared quiet. Guards walked their patrols with the bored efficiency of men who expected nothing to happen. They did not know that death was waiting in the darkness. They did not know that their trap had been exposed. 0230. Colonel Shaw appeared at Elena's shoulder. Any updates from Vance? Elena studied the latest propaganda footage that had been uploaded to the internet just hours ago. Danny was visible in the background, his fingers moving in the familiar patterns. He confirms the plan is still viable. Western approach, 0300. What about the distraction he promised? He says we will know it when we see it. Shaw nodded and returned to the command center. 0245. 15 minutes to go. The SEAL team began their approach, moving through the desert with the silent efficiency of predators. 8 shadows gliding toward a compound full of men who thought they were the hunters. Elena watched their progress on the satellite feed. Each step brought them closer to Danny. Each step brought the mission closer to the moment where everything could go wrong. 0255. 5 minutes. The team was in position at the western wall. They could see the guards on the eastern side concentrated as Danny had predicted. The trap was set for an approach that would never come. 0258. 2 minutes. Elena's hands were trembling. She clasped them together to still the shaking. This was the moment, the pivot point. Everything she had done for 18 months had led to this. 0259. 1 minute. On the satellite feed, something was happening inside the compound. Movement. Commotion. Guards were running toward one of the buildings. 0300. The distraction arrived. Later, Elena would learn the details. Danny had spent months gathering materials. A length of wire here. A container of fuel there. Small items that his captors did not think to track. Items that, combined with knowledge and patience, could create something spectacular. The explosion that ripped through the compound's communications center was not large enough to cause significant structural damage, but it was loud enough to wake the dead and bright enough to be seen for miles. Every guard in the compound ran toward the flames, exactly as Danny had planned. Viper team, you have a go, Colonel Shaw's voice commanded. Green light, I repeat, green light. The SEAL team moved. Elena watched through the drone feed as 8 operators breached the western wall and flowed into the compound with lethal precision. They moved through the buildings like ghosts, eliminating threats with the silent efficiency that only Tier 1 special operators could achieve. Overwatch, Viper lead, we are inside, proceeding to target location. Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard, monitoring communications, tracking the team's progress, watching for any sign that the enemy was responding. Viper team, be advised, Danny's cell is in Building 3, northwest corner. 2 guards assigned, but they may have responded to the distraction. Copy, Overwatch, approaching Building 3 now. The feed switched to the helmet camera of the team leader. Elena watched through his eyes as the operators stacked up on the door to Building 3. A silent countdown, a breach charge, an explosion of violence. Building 3 clear, moving to target cell. Elena held her breath. The team reached a heavy metal door at the end of a corridor. Through the helmet cam, she could see the locks, the reinforced frame, designed to keep someone inside. Breaching. The door blew inward, and there he was, Danny Vance, thin, bearded, blinking against the sudden light, but alive, standing on his own 2 feet, waiting for the rescue he had known would come. Target secure, I repeat, target secure. Vance is alive. Elena felt tears streaming down her face. She did not try to stop them. Danny, she keyed her microphone. Danny, it is Elena. We have you. Through the helmet cam, she saw Danny turn toward the sound of her voice coming through the operator's radio. His face transformed. The exhaustion and suffering fell away, replaced by something that looked like joy. I knew you would come, he said. His voice was hoarse from months of limited use. I knew you would figure it out. We are bringing you home. Copy that. A ghost of a smile crossed his haggard face. Tell them to hurry. I have a lot of intelligence to share, and I really want to see you in person. Viper team, be advised. Enemy forces are regrouping. You need to move now. The next 10 minutes were chaos. The team extracted Danny from the compound while fighting a running battle against guards who had finally realized what was happening. Gunfire echoed through the night. Explosions lit the sky. Elena coordinated everything. She tracked enemy movements through the satellite feed. She directed the team around ambush points. She called in air support when they got pinned down near the extraction point. And through it all, she never hesitated, never doubted, never let the weight of responsibility paralyze her. The helicopter lifted off at 0323, carrying 9 souls instead of 8. Danny was wounded, a bullet grazed across his shoulder, but he was alive. He was free. Elena sat back in her chair and let out a breath she had been holding for 18 months. It was over. He was coming home. The celebrations at the operations center were muted but genuine. Intelligence officers shook hands. SEAL team members embraced over video links from the extraction helicopter. Colonel Shaw allowed herself a rare smile. A mission that could have ended in disaster had succeeded beyond all expectations. Elena did not participate in the celebrations. She sat alone at her workstation, watching the medical feeds from the helicopter. Danny was being treated for dehydration, malnutrition, and the bullet wound he had sustained during the extraction. But he was stable. He was alive. And he would not stop looking at the camera, looking at her. "You should get some rest," Colonel Shaw said, appearing at her shoulder. "The debriefs can wait until tomorrow. I want to be here when he lands. That will not be for another 6 hours. The helicopter has to refuel twice before reaching friendly territory. I will wait." Shaw studied her for a moment. Then she pulled up a chair and sat down beside her. "You saved him, Elena. You saved the entire mission. Your analysis, your decisions, they made the difference between success and failure." "I was just doing my job." "No, you were doing more than that." Shaw leaned forward, her voice dropping. 18 months ago, you came to me and asked for a transfer. You said you could not trust yourself anymore. You said you were done with intelligence work. I remember. What changed? Elena considered the question. What had changed? The guilt was still there. The memory of Michael Torres and Kevin Williams dying in that Syrian compound would never leave her. But something was different now. "Raymond Colton," she said finally, "an old man who served with my father in classified operations. He found me at Camp Pendleton and reminded me of who I was supposed to be." "Who are you supposed to be?" "Someone who honors sacrifice by living fully. Someone who carries debt without being crushed by it. Someone who finds redemption through service rather than punishment." Shaw nodded slowly. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so." They sat in silence for a while, watching the medical feeds. Danny had fallen asleep, exhaustion finally overcoming his determination to stay awake. Even in sleep, his face held the marks of 18 months of suffering. The sunken cheeks, the premature lines, the scars that would never fully heal. "There is something you should know," Shaw said, "about the security breach, the one that almost got the team killed." Elena turned to face her. "Did you find the source?" "Yes." Shaw's expression had gone hard. "It was internal. One of our own communications officers was selling information to the enemy. He has been arrested and will face military tribunal." "Another betrayal." "Yes, another one." Shaw sighed heavily. "Sometimes I wonder if we are fighting the enemy out there or in here. We are fighting both. We always have been." Shaw stood up. "Get some rest, Commander. That is an order. I will wake you when the helicopter is 30 minutes out." Elena wanted to argue. She wanted to stay at the workstation, watching Danny sleep, making sure he was really alive. But Shaw was right. She was exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the mission was fading, leaving nothing but bone-deep fatigue. "Yes, Colonel." She found a cot in one of the rest areas and lay down. Sleep should have been impossible. Her mind was racing with everything that had happened, everything that was still to come. But somewhere between one thought and the next, exhaustion won, and she dreamed of her father. Harold Mercer was young in the dream, young and alive, wearing the jungle fatigues she had seen in Raymond's photograph. He was standing at the edge of a forest, looking back at her with those gray eyes that she had inherited. "You did good today," he said. His voice was exactly as she had always imagined it, calm, steady, full of quiet pride. "I was scared," Elena admitted. "I almost did not do it. Fear is natural. It is what you do with the fear that matters. I almost let it stop me. For 18 months, I let it stop me." Her father smiled. The same smile she saw in the mirror sometimes. The same smile she would see in Danny's face when he looked at her. "But you did not let it stop you today. Today, you chose to act. Today, you honored everything I tried to teach you." "I miss you," Elena said. "I have missed you my whole life. I know, and I am sorry I could not be there, but I have been watching. I have always been watching. He began to turn away, toward the forest, toward the darkness that had claimed him 53 years ago. Wait, Elena called. Will I see you again? Her father paused. He looked back at her one more time. You will see me every time you choose courage over fear. Every time you serve others instead of yourself. Every time you honor sacrifice by living fully. He smiled once more. I am proud of you, Elena. I have always been proud of you. Then he walked into the forest, and the dream dissolved into peaceful darkness. When Elena woke, 6 hours had passed. The helicopter was 30 minutes out, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The helicopter touched down at 0947. Elena stood on the tarmac, watching the aircraft descend through the morning sun. Her heart was pounding. Her hands were trembling. 18 months of grief and guilt and longing had led to this moment. The rotor slowed. The door opened. Medical personnel rushed forward with a stretcher. But Danny waved them away. He was walking, slowly, painfully, but under his own power. He stepped out of the helicopter and onto American soil. And then he saw her. They stared at each other across the tarmac. 100 feet of distance that felt like 100 years. Elena wanted to run to him, wanted to throw herself into his arms. But something held her back. Fear. Not fear of rejection. Not fear of what he might say. Fear that she did not deserve this moment. Fear that she had not earned the right to be happy when Michael Torres and Kevin Williams would never see their families again. Danny saw the hesitation in her eyes. He understood it. Of course he did. He knew her better than anyone. So he took the first step, and then another, and another. He walked across the tarmac with the determination of a man who had spent 18 months dreaming of this moment. Each step was painful, each breath was labored, but he kept coming. Elena felt her fear dissolving with each step he took. Raymond's words echoed in her mind. Your father did not die so you could punish yourself. He died so you could live. She started walking too. They met in the middle of the tarmac. Two people who had been broken by war, who had been separated by tragedy, who had found their way back to each other through darkness and distance. Danny reached out and touched her face. His hand was rough, calloused from months of captivity, but his touch was gentle. You came for me, he said. I will always come for you. I know, I never doubted. Elena felt the tears coming. She did not try to stop them. I thought I killed you. I thought you were dead because of me. I am alive because of you. Danny pulled her into his arms. Every day in that cell, I thought about you. Every day, I held on to the belief that you would figure it out, that you would find a way. I'm so sorry for everything. There is nothing to be sorry for. You saved me, Elena. You brought me home. They stood there on the tarmac, holding each other, while the California sun rose higher in the sky. The medical personnel waited patiently. The helicopter crew looked away, giving them privacy. This moment belonged to them alone. I have something to tell you, Danny said finally. What? In the cell, during the worst nights, I made a promise to myself. I promised that if I ever got out, I would not waste another day. I would not let fear or duty or anything else keep me from the life I wanted. He pulled back so he could look into her eyes. I want that life to be with you, Elena. I want to spend whatever time we have left together. No more secrets, no more hiding, just us. Elena thought about everything she had learned in the past few weeks, about sacrifice, about honor, about the way guilt could be transformed into purpose. Yes, she said, whatever comes next, we face it together. Danny smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him in 18 months. Together, he agreed. And standing there on the tarmac, surrounded by the aftermath of war, they began to imagine a future that neither had dared to dream of. A future built not on guilt, but on love. Not on punishment, but on redemption. Not on the shadows of the past, but on the light of what was still to come. The California sun rose over Camp Pendleton with the same indifferent brilliance it had displayed for 1,000 years. But for those who had witnessed the events of 2 months ago, nothing would ever look the same. The base had changed, not in its physical structure, not in its daily routines, but in something deeper. Something that lived in the way people looked at each other, in the way they spoke, in the quiet understanding that had spread through the ranks like water seeping into dry earth. Elena Mercer stood at the window of her new office, watching the morning light paint the parade grounds in shades of gold and amber. She wore civilian clothes now, simple and practical, but her bearing still carried the unmistakable mark of military service. Her left arm rested in a sling, the result of a bullet wound sustained during the extraction of Danny Vance. The wound had been minor, the doctor said, a through and through that missed all the major structures. She would regain full use of the arm within a few weeks. But Elena knew that the real wounds, the ones that mattered, were not the kind that showed up on medical scans. Those wounds were finally beginning to heal. 2 months had passed since she had stood on that tarmac and watched Danny walk toward her. 2 months since she had allowed herself to believe that redemption was possible. 2 months of debriefs and medical evaluations and the slow, patient work of rebuilding a life. Danny was recovering at a military hospital in San Diego. The 18 months of captivity had left their marks. Physical wounds that were healing, psychological wounds that would take longer. But he was alive. He was free. And every evening, Elena drove to the hospital to sit beside his bed and talk about the future they were building together. The intelligence he had gathered during his captivity had proven even more valuable than anyone had anticipated. 3 terrorist cells had been dismantled based on his information. Dozens of operatives had been captured or killed. The network that had held him was being systematically destroyed, piece by piece, thanks to the map he had drawn and the subtle movements of his fingers. Danny Vance had spent 18 months as a prisoner, but he had never stopped fighting. He had turned his captivity into a weapon, gathering intelligence that would save countless lives. The military was already talking about medals, commendations, recognition for a level of courage that most people could not comprehend. But Danny did not care about medals. He cared about Elena, about the life they would build when his recovery was complete, about the future that had seemed impossible just 2 months ago. Elena turned away from the window and surveyed her new office. It was located in a building that had not existed 2 months ago. The Resilient and Transition Hub, they called it. A center dedicated to helping service members navigate the psychological challenges of military life. A place where the broken could come to be mended. The center had been Colonel Shaw's idea. After the success of the Vance rescue, Shaw had used her considerable influence to secure funding for a pilot program at Camp Pendleton, and she had insisted that Elena be the one to lead it. Senior Leadership Consultant. That was her new title, a position that allowed her to serve without returning to the shadows of intelligence work. A role that let her use everything she had learned, all the pain and the guilt and the hard-won wisdom, to help others who were struggling with similar burdens. It was not the life Elena had imagined for herself, but it was the life she had earned, the life her father would have wanted for her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." The door opened and Raymond Colton entered, 70 years old and looking every day of it, but with a vitality in his eyes that had not been there 2 months ago. He had found his purpose. He had repaid his debt, and the transformation had taken decades off his spirit, if not his body. "Good morning, Commander," Raymond said. Elena smiled. "I am not a commander anymore, Raymond. You can call me Elena." Old habits. Raymond settled into one of the chairs facing her desk. "How is Danny?" "Better every day. The doctors say he might be released next week." "That is good news. Will he be coming here to the center?" "Eventually. He has his own recovery to complete first, but yes, we have talked about him joining the staff. His experience could help others who have been through similar trauma." Raymond nodded slowly. The morning light caught the lines on his face, each one a testament to the years he had lived and the burdens he had carried. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said, "before the ceremony today." Elena raised an eyebrow. "What ceremony?" "You do not know?" Raymond's expression shifted to something that might have been a smile. "Colonel Shaw did not tell you?" "Tell me what?" "There is going to be a dedication this afternoon. The base commander has authorized a memorial plaque to be installed near the flagpole." "A memorial for whom?" Raymond's smile widened. "For your father and for you." Elena felt the words land in her chest like stones dropped into still water. Ripples spreading outward, memories surfacing. "I do not understand." "The base commander was moved by what happened here 2 months ago, by the story of your father's sacrifice, by the way you honored that sacrifice through your own service. He decided that Camp Pendleton should have a permanent reminder of what true leadership looks like." Elena did not know what to say. The idea of her name being placed beside her father's, on a memorial that would stand for generations, was overwhelming. "I did not ask for this," she said finally. "No, that is precisely why you deserve it." They sat in silence for a moment. The morning continued its slow advance, light shifting across the walls, time flowing forward as it always did. "There is something else," Raymond said. "Someone who wants to speak with you before the ceremony. Someone who has been waiting for the right moment." "Who?" As if in answer, another knock came at the door. Elena called out permission to enter. The door opened, and Dalton Hayes stepped into the room. Elena barely recognized him. The man who stood in her doorway was not the arrogant, aggressive officer who had challenged her on the training field 2 months ago. That man had been all muscle and swagger, a fortress of compensating behaviors built to hide the frightened boy within. This man was different. Dalton Hayes had lost weight, not the unhealthy loss of illness, but the kind that came from hard work and changed priorities. His massive frame was still impressive, but it no longer seemed designed to intimidate. His shoulders, once permanently squared for confrontation, had relaxed into a posture that suggested openness rather than aggression. But the most striking change was in his eyes. The hardness that had defined him was gone. In its place was something softer, something that looked almost like peace. He was not wearing a uniform. Elena had heard that he had resigned his commission shortly after the events of 2 months ago. A voluntary separation, not a dismissal. He had chosen to leave the Marine Corps on his own terms. "Commander Mercer," Hayes said. His voice was quieter than she remembered, more measured. "It is just Elena now, and I understand you are no longer Captain Hayes." "No, ma'am, just Dalton." He stood in the doorway, clearly uncertain whether he was welcome. Raymond rose from his chair and moved toward the door. "I will give you two some privacy," the old man said. "Elena, I will see you at the ceremony." He patted Hayes on the shoulder as he passed, a gesture that spoke of conversations Elena had not witnessed, of connections that had formed in her absence. The door closed, leaving Elena and Dalton alone. "May I sit?" Dalton asked. Elena gestured to the chair Raymond had vacated. Dalton lowered himself into it with the careful movements of a man who had learned to take up less space. "I came to apologize," he said, properly, face to face, the way it should have been done 2 months ago. "You do not owe me an apology, Dalton. What happened on that training field, it was something we both needed." "No," Dalton shook his head firmly. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation, and I owe you gratitude." "Gratitude? You saved my life that day, Commander." "Not physically, something more important than that." Elena waited. She had learned that the most important things were often said in the spaces between words. Dalton took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of genuine reflection. "I spent 31 years trying to be worthy of my father's sacrifice. 31 years building myself into a weapon, measuring my value by how much damage I could inflict. And in all that time, I never once stopped to ask if that was what my father would have wanted." He paused. His hands, those massive instruments of violence, were clasped together in his lap. Harmless, humble. "When you stood on that mat and told me that my father died so I could live, not so I could dominate, something broke inside me. Not the good kind of breaking, the bad kind. The kind where all the lies you have told yourself come crashing down at once. That must have been painful. It was the worst moment of my life, standing there in front of 600 Marines, realizing that everything I had built myself around was wrong. That I had wasted 3 decades chasing a version of strength that my father would have been ashamed of." Elena thought of her own journey, the 18 months of hiding, the guilt that had consumed her, the slow, painful process of learning to see herself clearly. "What did you do after the ceremony, after I left?" Dalton smiled, a small, rueful expression. "I kept my promise. I went to the Veterans Hospital with Master Sergeant Colton." "Raymond." "Yes, Raymond. He took me there the next day. And what I saw," Dalton's voice trailed off. His eyes were distant, seeing memories that still affected him. "Tell me." "I saw men who had given everything. Men without legs, men without arms, men whose minds had been shattered by experiences that I had only read about in after-action reports. And I saw how they treated each other. With gentleness, with patience, with a kind of love that I had never understood." He looked at Elena directly. "There was one man, a sergeant major from the Gulf War era. He had lost both legs and most of his hearing. He spent his days in a wheelchair, moving from room to room, checking on the younger veterans, making sure they had everything they needed, telling them stories, listening to their fears." "What was his name?" "Patterson. Sergeant Major William Patterson. He served 3 tours, earned more medals than I have ever seen on one uniform. And he told me something that changed my life." "What did he tell you?" Dalton was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "He told me that the bravest thing a warrior can do is not die for his country. The bravest thing is to live for the people who love him, to carry the weight of survival without letting it crush him, to find meaning in service rather than sacrifice." The words resonated in the small office. Elena thought of her father, of Danny, of Raymond, who had spent 30 years learning that same lesson. What happened after that, she asked. I spent 8 weeks at that hospital. Not 1 week like our agreement. 8 weeks. Every day I went there and I listened. To the old veterans, to the young ones, to the families who visited and the staff who cared for them. Dalton leaned forward in his chair. And somewhere in those 8 weeks, I finally understood what my father died for. Not for glory, not for medals, not so his son could become the strongest man on base. He died so that others could have the chance to live meaningful lives, to build families, to serve their communities, to love and be loved. And what does that mean for you now? Dalton smiled again, a real smile this time, full of peace. I resigned my commission 3 weeks ago, not because I was ashamed of my service, but because I realized I could serve better in a different way. I have applied to work with the Wounded Warrior Project. If they accept me, I will spend the rest of my career helping veterans transition from combat to civilian life. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. The transformation she was witnessing was exactly what she had hoped for. What Raymond had hoped for, what her father would have hoped for. Your father would be proud, she said. I hope so. Dalton stood up. Thank you, Commander, for showing me what strength really looks like, for giving me the chance to become someone my father would have recognized. He extended his hand. Elena took it. His grip was firm but not crushing. The grip of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. I will see you at the ceremony, Dalton said. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back. There is one more thing you should know about Private Torres, Marcus. Elena's attention sharpened. She had wondered about Marcus, had asked Raymond about him several times during the past 2 months. What about him? He and I have been talking, working through some things together. He is a lot like I was, angry, lost, trying to live up to a dead father's legacy. I know. Raymond told you about the Torres family, about the connection to your father? Yes, Dalton nodded slowly. Marcus knows now too, about his great-grandfather serving with your father, about his cousin Michael dying in the operation you planned, about all of it. Elena felt her breath catch. How did he react? Not well at first. There was a lot of anger, a lot of blame looking for somewhere to land, but Raymond talked to him, helped him see the bigger picture, helped him understand that you were not his enemy, that you were carrying wounds just as deep as his own. And now he wants to talk to you. When you are ready, he has something he wants to ask you. Dalton opened the door and stepped out, but his final words lingered in the air behind him. He wants to know if he can learn from you, the way I learned from you, the way we all learned from you. The door closed, and Elena was alone with the weight of what she had just heard. The circle was closing. The generations were connecting. And somehow, in ways she had never anticipated, her father's sacrifice was still creating ripples that changed lives. Marcus Torres arrived at Elena's office an hour before the dedication ceremony. He looked different from the angry young man she remembered from the training field. The rage that had defined him was still present, but it was banked now, controlled, channeled into something that was not yet clear, but was no longer destructive. He stood at attention in her doorway, the posture of a Marine addressing a superior officer. Even though Elena no longer held any official rank, the gesture carried weight. Private Torres, Elena said, please sit down. Thank you, ma'am. He sat. His hands were clasped in his lap, the same position Dalton had adopted. Perhaps they had learned it together during their conversations. I understand you wanted to speak with me. Yes, ma'am. Marcus took a deep breath. I want to apologize first for how I treated you before, for the things I said, the disrespect. You did not know who I was. That does not matter. Master Sergeant Colton told me that you treat every person with respect until they prove they do not deserve it. I did not do that. I was so angry at everything that I took it out on anyone who seemed weak. And I was wrong about what weakness means. Elena studied the young man before her. 19 years old, a whole life ahead of him, carrying wounds that would take decades to fully heal. Raymond told me about your father, she said gently, about Antonio. I am sorry for your loss. Marcus's jaw tightened. The mention of his father still hurt. Perhaps it always would. Thank you, ma'am. And he told me about your cousin Michael, about his connection to the Syria operation. The words hung in the air. This was the heart of it, the connection that linked their families across generations and through tragedy. I did not know, Marcus said. When I was mocking you on the training field, I did not know that you were the one who planned the mission where Michael died. I did not know about any of it. Does knowing change how you feel? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Elena watched the emotions play across his face. The anger, the grief, the struggle to find words for feelings that were too big to contain. When Master Sergeant Colton first told me, I wanted to hate you. I wanted someone to blame for Michael's death, for my father's death, for all of it, and you were the easiest target. I understand. But then Colton told me the rest, about your father, about how he died saving Colton's life, about how our families have been connected for 50 years without anyone knowing. And he told me about the operation, about the double agent who fed you false intelligence, about how you blamed yourself even though it was not your fault. Marcus looked up. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. My father killed himself because he could not carry the weight of what he had seen and done. Michael died because someone betrayed his team. And you punished yourself for 18 months for something that was not your fault. I was responsible for the intelligence that sent them into that ambush. No, Marcus shook his head firmly. You were betrayed, just like they were. You were another victim of the same enemy. And instead of seeing that, I treated you like you were the enemy yourself. Elena felt the tears coming. She did not try to stop them. This young man, this orphan who had every reason to hate her, was offering absolution that she had never expected to receive. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because I want to learn from you, the way Captain Hayes learned, the way everyone who saw what you did on that training field learned. What do you want to learn? Marcus leaned forward. The anger was gone from his face now. In its place was something that looked like determination. I want to learn how to carry the weight without being crushed by it. I want to learn how to turn grief into something useful instead of letting it destroy me. I want to learn how to be the man my father and Michael would have wanted me to become. He paused. I want to learn how to be a quiet professional, like you, like your father. Elena wiped her eyes. The phrase hit her with unexpected force. A quiet professional, the highest compliment one special operator could pay to another. The designation reserved for those who served without seeking recognition, who sacrificed without demanding credit, who found their strength in silence rather than spectacle. You want to work here, Elena said. It was not a question. If you will have me, I know I have not earned it. I know I have a lot to learn, but I am willing to work. I am willing to change. Elena looked at him for a long moment. She saw the ghost of his great-grandfather Miguel, who had served alongside her father in the jungles of the shadows of classified operations. She saw the shadow of his father, Antonio, who had fought his own demons and lost. She saw the memory of his cousin Michael, who had died in an ambush that she had planned. And she saw something else. Potential, the same potential that Raymond had seen in her, the same potential that her father had seen in the men he led. You can start next week, Elena said, but I have conditions. Anything. You will attend counseling, real counseling, with professionals who specialize in grief and trauma. The anger you carry will destroy you if you do not learn to process it properly. Yes, ma'am. You will continue your conversations with Raymond and Dalton. They have walked the path you are on. They can guide you in ways I cannot. Yes, ma'am. And you will remember something. Every day that you walk through those doors, you represent 4 generations of Torres men who served this country. Miguel, Antonio, Michael, and now you. Their legacy lives in you. Honor it. Marcus stood up. He came to attention as crisp and perfect as any parade ground formation. I will not let you down, Commander. I will not let any of them down. Elena rose and extended her hand. Marcus took it. Welcome to the team, Private Torres. The handshake was firm, a connection across generations, a bridge between past and future. The circle was complete. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parade ground as the dedication ceremony began. A crowd had gathered near the flagpole. Marines in dress uniforms, veterans in civilian clothes, family members who had traveled from across the country to witness this moment. And at the center of it all, a simple wooden plaque covered by a dark cloth, waiting to be revealed. Elena stood in the front row, flanked by Raymond on one side and Danny on the other. Danny had been released from the hospital just that morning, against medical advice because he insisted on being present for this ceremony. He leaned on a cane, his body still recovering from 18 months of captivity, but his eyes were clear and his spirit was strong. Dalton Hayes stood nearby, wearing civilian clothes that somehow looked more natural on him than his uniform ever had. Marcus Torres was beside him, young and uncertain but present. two broken men learning to mend each other. Colonel Shaw stood at the podium, preparing to address the crowd. The base commander stood beside her, along with several other senior officers who had come to pay their respects. "We are gathered here today to honor sacrifice," Shaw began. Her voice carried across the parade ground with the clarity of command. "Not the sacrifice of a single moment, but the sacrifice of a lifetime. The sacrifice that ripples forward through generations, touching lives that the original act could never have anticipated." She paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. 53 years ago, Colonel Harold James Mercer gave his life to save 5 of his men. He walked into an enemy ambush alone, knowing he would not survive, so that others could live. That act of courage earned him the Medal of Honor, the highest recognition our nation can bestow. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes. She had heard this story many times now, from Raymond, from official reports, from the fragments of memory that connected her to a father she had barely known. But hearing it spoken aloud in this place, surrounded by people who understood its significance, made it feel new again. But the story did not end with Colonel Mercer's death, Shaw continued. It continued through the life of one of the men he saved, Master Sergeant Raymond Colton, who carried the weight of that sacrifice for 5 decades, never forgetting, always seeking to honor the gift he had been given. Raymond stood a little straighter. His eyes were fixed on the covered plaque, but Elena knew his mind was somewhere else, in a jungle 30 years ago, at a wall in Washington, in all the moments between that had led to this. And the story continued through Colonel Mercer's daughter, Elena Mercer, who inherited her father's courage and commitment, who served her country in the shadows, making decisions that saved countless lives, who, when faced with her own moment of crisis, found the strength to continue serving, to continue sacrificing, to continue honoring the legacy she had inherited. Shaw gestured towards the covered plaque. 2 months ago, Elena Mercer stood on this very ground and demonstrated something that every person in uniform needs to understand. True strength is not measured in muscles or aggression. True strength is the ability to choose restraint when violence would be easier. True strength is the courage to be vulnerable. True strength is the wisdom to know that the greatest victories are the ones that do not require defeating anyone. She reached for the cloth covering the plaque. "This memorial will stand here for generations. It will remind every Marine who passes it that sacrifice comes in many forms, that courage can be quiet, that the greatest heroes are often the ones we never notice." She pulled the cloth away. The plaque was simple, elegant, the kind of memorial that does not need ornament because its meaning is sufficient. 2 names were engraved on its surface: Colonel Harold James Mercer, 1930 to 1971. Who taught us that leadership is service? Elena Mercer, who taught us that strength is restraint. Below the names, a single line was inscribed: "In their honor, we choose courage over fear, service over self, and love over pride." The crowd was silent. Then slowly a single person began to clap. Then another. Then the entire parade ground erupted in applause. Elena stood frozen, staring at the plaque, her name beside her father's. Their legacies intertwined for all time. The connection she had spent her whole life seeking, finally made permanent. Danny's hand found hers. His grip was weak but warm, a reminder that she was not alone, that she would never be alone again. Raymond stepped forward and placed his palm against the plaque, the same gesture he had made at the wall in Washington so many times before. "We did it, Hal," he whispered. The words were meant for a dead man, but Elena heard them. "We finally did it. Your daughter knows who she is. Your sacrifice means something. The debt is paid." He stood there for a long moment, communing with a ghost only he could see. Then he stepped back and looked at Elena with eyes that held 30 years of waiting, finally released. "Your father would be proud," he said. "I know," Elena replied. "I finally know." The ceremony ended. The crowd dispersed. The afternoon gave way to evening, and the evening gave way to night. Elena sat on the bench overlooking the Pacific Ocean, the same bench where she and Raymond had talked so many times during her months of hiding. The stars were emerging, points of light in the vast darkness, reminders that the universe continued regardless of human struggles. Danny sat beside her, his cane propped against the bench, his body finally relaxing after the exertion of the day. "It is beautiful here," he said. "It is where I came to think, when I was hiding from myself. And now? Now it is where I come to remember, to be grateful, to plan for what comes next." Danny was quiet for a moment. The waves crashed against the rocks below, a rhythm as old as the earth itself. "I have been thinking about what comes next," he said, "for us, for our life together." "And what have you decided?" Danny turned to face her. In the starlight, his face was shadowed, but his eyes were clear. "I want to work here, at the center, when I am recovered enough. I want to help other veterans who are struggling with what they have seen and done." "That is what I hoped you would say. And I want to marry you, not because of what we have been through, not because we survived, but because I have loved you since the day we met, and I do not want to waste another moment pretending otherwise." Elena felt her heart swell. The proposal was not romantic in the traditional sense. There was no ring, no kneeling, no practiced speech. It was simply Danny, being honest, being real, being the man she had fallen in love with years ago. "Yes," she said, "to all of it, the work, the marriage, the life, yes." Danny smiled, the first full, unguarded smile she had seen from him since before his capture. "I love you, Elena. I love you too." They sat together in the darkness, watching the stars, listening to the waves, feeling the weight of the past lifting and the promise of the future settling in its place. Behind them, the lights of Camp Pendleton glowed against the night sky, the base where Elena had come to hide, the place where she had found herself, the ground where 4 generations of sacrifice had finally come together to create something new. Tomorrow, she would return to the center. She would counsel broken veterans and train new staff. She would welcome Marcus Torres as her assistant and watch him begin his own journey toward healing. Tomorrow, Raymond would continue his work, helping young Marines understand the true meaning of service. Dalton would pursue his new calling with the Wounded Warrior Project. Danny would begin his recovery in earnest, building the strength he would need for the life they would share. Tomorrow, the work of healing would continue. But tonight, there was just this: 2 people who had found their way back to each other. 2 hearts that had been broken and were learning to beat together again. 2 lives that had been defined by sacrifice, now choosing to be defined by love. And somewhere in the darkness, perhaps, the ghost of Harold Mercer watched his daughter and smiled. His sacrifice had been worth it. His legacy would endure. His daughter had finally come home. Epilogue, 6 months later. The spring sun warmed the parade ground at Camp Pendleton as another group of visitors arrived at the memorial plaque. Elena watched from her office window. She recognized the pattern now. Veterans who had heard the story, families who had lost loved ones, young service members seeking inspiration. They came from across the country, drawn by something they could not quite name, seeking something they could not quite articulate. They came to touch the plaque, to read the names, to absorb whatever wisdom the simple memorial might offer. Today's visitors were different. An elderly man in a wheelchair, pushed by a younger woman who might have been his daughter. A family with 3 children, the father wearing a veteran's cap. A young Marine in dress uniform, standing at attention before the memorial. Elena had stopped wondering why they came. She had stopped trying to quantify the impact. Some things were beyond measurement. Some legacies could not be captured in numbers or statistics. Her father had walked into a jungle 30 years ago, and the ripples were still spreading. "You are doing that thing again." Elena turned. Danny stood in the doorway of her office, his cane now more accessory than necessity. His recovery had been remarkable, driven by a determination that refused to acknowledge limitations. "What thing?" Staring out the window, looking profound, thinking deep thoughts. Elena smiled. "I'm not thinking deep thoughts. I am watching people visit the memorial." "Same thing." Danny crossed the room and stood beside her at the window. His hand found hers, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "Marcus asked me to remind you about the staff meeting at 3. I remember. And Raymond called. He wants to have dinner tonight. Says he has stories he has not told you yet about your father." There are always more stories. That is the nature of legacy. It keeps revealing itself layer by layer for as long as people are willing to listen. They watched the visitors at the memorial for a while. The elderly man in the wheelchair was crying now, his daughter's hand on his shoulder. The young Marine had removed his cover and was holding it against his chest, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not come back?" Danny asked. "If you had stayed hidden at the medical building forever?" "Sometimes." And I think the universe would have found another way. Raymond would have found another opportunity to repay his debt. Dalton would have been broken by something else, something that might not have led to healing. Marcus would have drowned in his anger. She paused. "But I think the people I was meant to help would have found their way eventually. The healing might have taken longer. The paths might have been harder, but I believe that redemption always finds a way. It is too powerful to be stopped by human weakness. Danny was quiet for a moment. I used to think that survival was the hardest thing, he said. Staying alive in that cell day after day, holding on to hope when everything told me to give up. And now I know that survival was the easy part. Living, really living, choosing to build something meaningful from the wreckage. That is the hard part. That is the real courage. Elena squeezed his hand. We are doing the hard part now. Yes, and it is worth it. Every day it is worth it. Below them, the visitors were dispersing. The elderly man's daughter was pushing his wheelchair away, both of them moving slowly, perhaps carrying something new that they had found at the memorial. The family with children was taking photographs. The young Marine was replacing his cover, his face transformed by whatever he had experienced. New visitors would come tomorrow, and the day after, and for years beyond that. Because the legacy of a sacrifice did not end with the people who made the sacrifice. It continued through everyone who was touched by it, everyone who learned from it, everyone who chose to honor it by living fully, serving gladly, and loving deeply. Harold Mercer had died in a jungle 30 years ago, but his story was still being written, and it would never end. In the years that followed, the Resilience and Transition Hub became a model for military mental health programs across the country. Other bases requested guidance. Other commanders sought Elena's counsel. The quiet revolution she had started on a training field spread outward, touching lives she would never know. Marcus Torres completed his training and became one of the center's most effective counselors. His journey from angry orphan to compassionate healer inspired countless young veterans who saw themselves in his story. He never forgot the debt he owed to Raymond, to Elena, to the legacy of 4 generations who had sacrificed so he could find his path. Dalton Hayes built a new career with the Wounded Warrior Project, eventually becoming a regional director. The man who had once measured his worth by how much damage he could inflict, now measured it by how many lives he could help rebuild. His father's Navy Cross sat in a place of honor in his office, a reminder not of the glory he had chased, but of the love that had been behind his father's sacrifice. Raymond Colton lived another 7 years. 7 years of purpose, 7 years of meaning, 7 years of finally being at peace with the debt he had carried for so long. He died in his sleep at 77, surrounded by the family he had built and the legacy he had helped create. His funeral was attended by hundreds of veterans, young and old, who had been touched by his wisdom and his example. Elena spoke at his funeral. She talked about a man who had spent 30 years carrying a burden and who had finally found a way to set it down. She talked about the connection between generations, the way sacrifice creates ripples that travel through time. And she talked about love, the love that drives men to die for each other, the love that sustains those left behind, the love that ultimately makes all sacrifice meaningful. Danny stood beside her as she spoke, his hand in hers, their lives woven together in ways that nothing could ever separate. And every November 15th, they made a pilgrimage to Washington, D.C. They stood before the black granite wall in whatever weather the day brought, and they talked to a man who had died before Elena was old enough to remember his face. They told him about the center, about the lives they were saving, about the legacy he had created without ever knowing it. They told him about Marcus and Dalton and all the others who had been transformed by the story of his sacrifice. And they told him that they loved him, that they honored him, that every good thing in their lives existed because he had chosen to walk into that jungle alone. The wall never answered. It never could. But somehow, standing there in the silence, they always felt heard. Because legacy is not about the dead. It is about the living. It is about the choices we make to honor those who came before us. It is about the courage to carry forward the torch that others have handed to us, even when the weight seems unbearable. Harold Mercer had carried a torch through the jungles of the shadows of classified operations. Raymond Colton had carried it through 30 years of guilt and searching. Elena had carried it through 18 months of darkness and out the other side. And now countless others were carrying it forward. Young veterans learning to process their trauma. Old soldiers finally finding peace. Families discovering that their loved ones' sacrifices had meaning beyond what they could have imagined. The torch would never go out. The legacy would never end. Because in the end, that is what sacrifice means. Not an ending, but a beginning. Not a death, but a birth. Not a loss, but an investment in a future that the one who sacrifices will never see. Harold Mercer had known that somehow. had understood it in the moment he turned back to look at his men one last time before walking into the jungle. He had known that he was not ending his story. He was beginning theirs. And theirs would continue for generations to come. The end.